John, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine and Count of Anjou, to his archbishops, bishops, abbots, earls, barons, justices, foresters, sheriffs, stewards, servants, and to all his officials and loyal subjects, greetings. King John is one of the most infamous kings in English history. When you hear his name, all sorts of negative words come to mind to describe him, whether it's from modern media or from contemporary chroniclers such as Matthew Paris, History of William the Marshal, Gerald of Wales, Ralph of Coggeshall, and Roger of Wendover. Modern historians have attempted to cleanse the whitewash of King John's reputation and present a clearer picture of his reign, rather than John's kingship being condensed into one single point in history, that of the signing of the Magna Carta, as John ruled England for 17 years. 21st century historians aren't trying to re-evaluate King John as a misunderstood king, but to provide context on how he became the villain that is within the public consciousness, as he did indeed commit villainous acts and conducted himself cruelly at times. Some actions he took were on par with his predecessors, and in some cases he succeeded far more than his father Henry and his brother Richard. Yet it's difficult to give a precise and straightforward story of John's life due to the vast amount of information from different chroniclers during John's time and after. However, we can look into John's reign with more details, as there exists plenty of court rolls and documents from his time as king. Like his father before him, John was an efficient administrator, but unlike his father and brother Richard, John lost his biggest battles, which set the stage for his rather dull and painful end. Let's look at what some of the chroniclers of John's time stated about him and slightly after his death in 1216. No one may ever trust him, for his heart is soft and cowardly. This short quote perfectly summarizes a good amount of the opinions of contemporary chroniclers on King John. Here is a more extended quote from a Flemish anonymous contemporary chronicler from the 13th century. A very bad man, more cruel than all others, he lusted after beautiful women, and because of this he shamed the high men of the land, for which reasons he was greatly hated. Whenever he could, he told lies rather than the truth. He set his barons against one another whenever he could. He was very happy when he saw hate between them. He hated and was jealous of all honourable men. It greatly displeased him when he saw anyone acting well. He was brimful of evil qualities. Let's not mention Henry I's Lover Palace in Oxford, although the same Flemish account goes on to state, but he spent lavishly. He gave plenty to eat and did so generously and willingly. People never found the gates or doors of John's hall barred against them, so that all who wanted to eat at his court could do so. At the 3 great feasts, he gave robes aplenty to his knights. This was a good quality of his. Other Middle Ages chroniclers have stated that John was nature's enemy, infinite curses on his own perfidious head. And one final quote from where John was clearly in hell, according to Matthew Paris. Foul as is hell, John's presence there makes it fouler still. John's reputation of being a villain and an evil man carries on into the Victorian age, with the historian William Stubbs offering the following historical assessment of King John. The very worst of all of our kings, polluted with every crime that could disgrace a man. We must, however, throw shade at the Victorians, the worst medievalists. who destroyed so much of what remained of Middle Ages art and architecture. I'm specifically referring to medieval doom paintings. Moving on to modern historians, there is one quote that summarises John's kingship so perfectly, I doubt anyone could improve or top this quote. He sowed mistrust and eventually rebellion. This was perhaps not an evil king, nor even the pantomime villain of later legend. John lacked neither brains nor guile, but his political intelligence, like his personality, was warped by cruelty, dishonesty, and mistrust. In terms of events being described as biblical disasters, such as crops failing being a sign of poor kingship, during King John's reign, there was only one reported year in which the harvest failed, in 1203. If there were more, then no doubt they would have been used as examples by contemporary chroniclers for even more condemnation of John's reign. But what made John a villain in the first place? Was it the mysterious death or murder of his nephew Arthur, Duke of Brittany, or John's treatment of his subjects? Or was John's personality just so egregiously bad? If we look at the history of William the Marshal, a source written less than a decade after John's death, and portrays a romanticised life of the Marshal, the following text gives us the classical portrayal of John as a paranoid, villainous snake. When he left Rouen, he had his baggage train sent on ahead secretly and silently at Bonneville. He stayed the night in the castle, not in the town, for he feared a trap, believing that his barons had sworn to hand him over to the King of France. In the morning, he slipped away before daybreak, while everyone thought he was still asleep. This is during the period where King John was beginning to lose his lands in France to one of the most powerful and impressive kings of France to ever wear the crown, Philip II, or better known as Philip Augustus. This is also where John gained another nickname for himself, Soft Sword. He already had one nickname, Lackland, allegedly granted by his ever-loving father, Henry II. Before we explore King John's history and the impact it left on British history, let's first try and get to know him, with evidence of his personality and what hobbies he enjoyed. Let's start with John's hobbies. A typical hobby for a noble during the Middle Ages: hunting. King John loved hunting, as did his father, Henry II. Even during a time when King John should have been conducting warfare in Normandy in 1204, he still took the time for a vigorous hunt. Perhaps for the freedom it offered, as this quote from the late 12th century by Richard Fitzneal from the Dialogue of the Exchequer. It is in the forest too that kings' chambers are, and their chief delights, for they come there, laying aside their cares now and then, to hunt, as a rest and recreation. It is there they can put from them the anxious turmoil native to a court, and take a little breath in the free air of nature. John made sure he would have a good hunt in Normandy, as he imported wild animals such as foxes, otters, badgers, deers, and even wild boars, to be hunted with hounds or birds of prey, which leads us to John's next hobby, falconry. John was quite attached to his birds of prey, and one particular falcon, named Gibbon, was John's favourite. The bird was fed meat richer than most peasants could have. King John ordered Gibbon to be well fed with plump goats and good hens, with hare once a week. John had a flair for interior design, ordering the refurbishment of many properties around England after his losses in France, from castles, hunting lodges, and palaces. John and his court were constantly on the move around his kingdom, so John made sure that his properties were suitable for his tastes and standards, as he would spend between 1 to 3 days at these locations. He certainly had enough money to spend. Winchester was one of John's favourite locations to stay at. Maybe one reason is that the beds there were sturdy, as the last hobby we will mention is that John enjoyed sleeping around. His passion for lovemaking is one reason he's condemned by some chroniclers. John fathered many illegitimate children, and he faced accusations before and after his death of lusting after the wives and daughters of his barons. Yet there is no solid evidence of these claims, and if we compare John with his predecessors, his father had many lovers, and his great-grandfather, Henry I, had so many children that we don't know the exact number. Now we will try to look into John's personality, which varies depending on the source. We can gauge parts of John's character with various attributes, such as arrogance, a superiority complex, vanity, paranoid, and untrustworthy, which so far are all negative. Yet most of these traits do surface in the story of King John, as his nephew perished under his care. For a lighter characteristic, we have records of John's dry wit and humour, as this quote tells us. When the king told Robert that his lord the Count of Flanders had landed at Sandwich, Robert asked why he wasn't already on his way to see him. "Listen to the Fleming," said the king. "He thinks his lord, the Count, really counts for something." "By St. Jack," replied Robert, "I'm right, that he does." John laughed and rode so fast to Canterbury that most of his staff, their horses exhausted, were left behind. He went straight to Ferran's lodgings, greeted him courteously, and invited him to dine with him the next day. The quote is just a taste of John's personality, and as we go forward in his story, we'll come across more of his traits in the following episodes. For the final part of this particular episode, we will listen to a first-hand account describing John from Gerald of Wales, who accompanied John, who at the time was 18 years old, on his journey to Ireland in order to claim the lordship. Previously, Gerald had described John's other brothers, Richard and Geoffrey, in negative terms. The other, led away by the fervour of youth and ensnared by its passions, is prone to vice and rude to his monitors, lending himself to the seductions of his time of life, instead of resisting the impulses of nature. Hitherto, therefore, by reason of his age, he is more given to pleasures than to arms, to dalliance than to endurance, to juvenile levity, more as yet than to manly maturity, which he has not attained. He employs most of his time in those evil courses which gallants pursue, by which even youths who are naturally good are often roused to feats of arms, and soar from the camp of Cupid to the arts and towers of Pallas. As, then, he has obeyed the laws of green youth, so he will conform to those of subsequent age. Since, therefore, it is no disgrace to have enjoyed the pleasures of youth, but the shame lies in not bringing them to an end. Juvenile levity is excusable if the mature age be commendable, and that stage of life is blameless if age sets bounds to indulgence. The tree which bends its boughs downwards cannot strike deep roots. This is the last of the three brothers. May he not be the last in virtue, but being always dutiful to both his parents, may his days be long and prosperous on earth. May he as truly conform to the description given by Merlinus Ambrosius in a prophecy much noised abroad, of the man before whom the walls of Ireland shall fall. As he appears to answer it, His beginning, it says, shall be abandoned to loose living, but his end shall waft him to heaven. King John's early life was filled with as much drama and action as his kingship. Yet John was not always involved in the drama, as his family was some of the most famous figures during the High Middle Ages. His mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose own achievements and tales forged an image of a woman who was determined to get her way and always strived to assist her children in gaining what she believed was rightfully theirs. And alongside is her equally famous husband and John's father, Henry II, or Henry Fitz-Empress, the man who created the Angevin Empire thanks to his family connections. Henry ruled his lands with a vigorous attitude and enjoyed the power and lands he obtained, guarding them jealously even from his own family. With parents as famous as these, John's early life would be marked by their actions. John was born in December of the year 1166 or early 1167. We are not 100% sure of the date or even the location, with some sources listing it as Oxford and others as London. Regardless, he was born in England. John would be the last child born between Eleanor and Henry, as they produced 8 children, 5 boys and 3 girls. For Eleanor, she had an additional 2 daughters from her previous marriage to the King of France, Louis VII, before their divorce. An impressively terrifying feat, as childbirth was incredibly dangerous during the Middle Ages, even for a noblewoman. So to have had 10 children and to survive is an act worthy of respect. As for John, being the last child, he was not of much concern, as King Henry had 3 older sons, Henry, Richard and Geoffrey. King Henry in 1169 agreed a treaty with the French king to divide his lands between his sons, which would see the vast empire King Henry created cut apart and shared out. His eldest son Henry would be given the Kingdom of England, the county of Anjou, as well as Normandy, and even crowned as King of England while his father was alive. This event was something that never happened in England, and as we will find out later, has never happened since. Richard would be granted the lands that his mother inherited, Aquitaine. And as for Geoffrey, he would become Duke of Brittany. As for John, it seemed he would get diddly squat, apart from some estates in England, giving to his later nickname Lackland. John's name is also unique. This quote from Professor Nicholas Vincent gives insight into a reason for John's name. He was given a distinctively unroyal name, probably in honour of St. John the Evangelist, whose feast day fell on the 27th of December. John's eldest brothers had all been named after ruling ancestors. John's infancy would be a typical upbringing as any other royal baby of the High Middle Ages, cared for by a wet nurse, servants, friends and relations. King Henry and Queen Eleanor would conduct the business of the realm, leaving little time, if any, to spend with John. After all, the servants and other relations would look after him to the best of their abilities. And it has to be stated that John could have shared the same fate as his brother, the firstborn son of Henry and Eleanor, William, who died in infancy. John's first location we have on record was the Abbey of Fontevraud, a family favourite place, and now the resting place of most of the family. John lived here for a time with his older sister, Joanna. While John's childhood would continue like any other, significant events were happening around him. In 1169, John's mother was nearly captured by discontented barons, and in 1170, an event that became the defining mark of Henry II's reign, the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. Henry reportedly shouted a phrase along the lines of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The arguments between the king and the archbishop, to summarise, were over church rights and the relationship between kings and the Catholic Church. This event had an impact on lead production. As John grew older, it became clear to his father that John would need at least some lands to provide for him. To fix this issue, King Henry had diplomatic options available to him by using John to secure an alliance through marriage, which was a tactic commonly used during the Middle Ages for the nobility. John was aged around 5 or 6 years old when his father began to start matchmaking for him. Henry had started negotiations with the Count of Savoy. The lands John would gain from this match would enable Henry to expand his influence into northern Italy, as well as give another border to the Angevin Empire, encircling more of the King of France's domain, as John would have married the heir to the Count of Savoy, thus enabling John to inherit the lands and title of Count of Savoy. The only problem for John was, what did he bring to the table for the Count? Other than being the son of the King of England, John had nothing yet, as his father hadn't given him any lands, estates or titles as of yet. So Henry had to provide something, and he quickly did. A set of important castles, including the mighty castle at Chinon, one of King Henry's favourite locations. However, that castle was supposedly the younger King Henry's castle, and this did not sit well with the young lion. As for the last few years since his crowning, the young King Henry was constantly grappling with his father over power, or lack thereof. And this action of granting one of his castles to his younger brother without his consent was enough that the young Henry sought to stage his own revolt. Yet young King Henry was not in a strong position to challenge his father directly. He needed allies, and he knew exactly where to find them: his own mother and her ex-husband, the King of France. Young Henry left for Paris and was soon followed, thanks again to their mother, by her 2 other sons, 15-year-old Richard and 14-year-old Geoffrey. We can only offer theories as to why Eleanor betrayed her husband, but the act itself was shocking. As for John, he would get to know his father and share a close relationship with him, as John was too young to be of use and was under the care of his father. King Henry was to face an uprising that featured incredibly powerful figures. Not only 3 of his sons, his wife, but the King of France, the King of Scots, William the Lion, and several barons, both English and French, all sought to take Henry down. Power, lands, and wealth were the aim of the game. On a manuscript, it would seem that King Henry would lose and would be forced to give humiliating concessions. But King Henry would not be defeated so easily, as he inherited his mother's stubborn determination, as he gained the Kingdom of England through fighting a war. Politics and warfare was second nature to Henry. Plus he had his own key allies within his administration, as well as loads of cash to hire mercenaries, and he soon proved his superiority over his opponents. Eleanor was captured quickly, in one tale disguised as a man. This trick to escape will come up a lot in the future. Another ally of the coalition met his death via a crossbow bolt, Matthew, the Count of Boulogne. The King of the Scots, William the Lion, roared into battle and was captured immediately, and after a few more fights, King Henry was victorious, and John got to witness a masterclass, with a bit of luck, in dealing with vassals and rivals. After his brothers returned to their father's side, they were given an enlarged purse with more revenue. For John, he became his father's favourite son and would barely see his mother, so not much of a change. Now she was locked up, but not in some dingy, disgusting dungeon, although her older boys did voice their opposition to their mother's circumstances, which King Henry could use to his advantage if the cubs felt like challenging his authority again. As for John, this opened new doors for him. Now regarded as his father's favourite, the term Lackland would soon lose all meaning, as John would gain a hefty chunk of lands and revenue. His marriage arrangement with the Count fell through, as his betrothed died. She did have a younger sister, but King Henry had lost interest in the match. And by 1175, John would gain lands in Cornwall as one of the last veterans of the Civil War known as the Anarchy. Reginald, Earl of Cornwall, died. He had no legitimate sons, but 3 daughters. The 3 girls would become wards of King Henry, and despite the normal circumstances of the girls gaining their inheritance, King Henry interfered and made sure John gained the lion's share of it. Now that John was given a substantial amount of estates, which would still be governed by his father's administration until he became of age. More estates were to be gained for John through marriage. Another female heir to a noble was Isabella, daughter of William, Earl of Gloucester. The main prize here for John was the city of Bristol, which would grant access to the rich trade via the port there. Yet John was too young to marry at the age of 9 and would require special permission from the Pope in accordance with canon law. While all of these events were happening, John would carry on with his education. While he lived at the abbey, he was educated by the nuns there, and now an older John would begin his further development in training at the late age of 10. John's brothers had all begun their training at a younger age. We can offer an example of the education a boy in the upper classes of society could experience. In his 7th year, he was sent away into the care of a man of experience. This was his first loss of freedom. He had to face cares and obligations unknown to him before, a stern discipline in the shape of the study of books and languages. He had tasted freedom only to lose it. For John, his education would now be in the care of the household of Ranulph Glanville, one of King Henry's top men. Here John would learn everything he needed, from reading and writing in Latin to the social expectations of high Middle Ages society. Some of the lessons John would attend would be in archery, chess, falconry, hunting, and horse riding. All of these lessons were crucial if John was to govern and protect his own estates. By 1177, John would be at the forefront of Henry's plan of conquering Ireland, with John being proclaimed as King of Ireland. In this episode, we are not covering John in Ireland, as that will be its own episode, because Ireland in this period is incredibly unique. The next major event for John would be in 1183. In the previous year, Henry and his sons showed by working together they could surmount any challenge that laid before them. Richard was having trouble with rebels in his lands in Aquitaine. The combined might of the Angevins quickly subdued the rebels, yet the unity of father and sons working together soon fractured. During a family gathering around Christmas in 1182, the family began to quarrel over various matters, one being homage between the brothers. This soon turned into open war between the brothers, and in turn the young King Henry revolted against his father once again, with each side squaring up. But then tragedy struck. The young King Henry fell ill and died. With his death, John would become even more important in his father's plans. The year is 1183, and with the death of the young King Henry, John would benefit the most. The immediate consequence was an intense grieving period for King Henry and Queen Eleanor. Although not together, as Eleanor was still under house arrest for her part in the uprising against the elder King Henry. The plans King Henry had made were now cast into the wind. His treaty with the French king was now worthless. Dividing his lands between his sons would have to be redrawn. King Henry's grief over his son and heir's death was tremendous, no doubt amplified by his refusal to see his dying son over fears that the young king's dying days was a trap. The young king was a popular chap, and without him the uprising soon quelled, bar one baron who would only surrender to the king personally. Yet a king such as Henry has little time to mourn and must see to the running of his kingdom. King Henry headed to Angers to meet with Richard and Geoffrey. These two sons of Henry were already starting to make a name for themselves. Richard was developing his reputation as a soldier from fighting rebels in his duchy of Aquitaine, and Geoffrey, who by one account is described as, for Geoffrey of Brittany, although the wiliest and most plausible of all the king's sons, was also the most generally distrusted and disliked. While King Henry began revising his plans for his surviving sons, he sent word to John to sail for Normandy. While the young King Henry's death was not a crippling blow to the Angevin Empire, it did create new tension with the French king. However, this was not the French king Henry had bested time and time again. No, this was a new young French king, with grand ambitions to change France forever, and would become a reoccurring foe for the Angevins, especially for John. The new French king was Philip II, or also known as Philip Augustus, for his later achievements. His father, Louis VII, had died in 1180 from the effects of a stroke. Philip was only 15 when he became senior king. Philip had one policy towards the Angevins: to break them. The young King Henry's widow was also the French king's sister, and Philip demanded that King Henry return her dowry. The issues were settled at a peace conference, and for future reference, there is going to be a lot of peace conferences between the Angevins and the French king. King Henry's next plan was a simple reshuffle of which sons get what land and titles, although this time there would be no junior king. The plan was simple. Richard, now the eldest son, would inherit England, Normandy, and Anjou. Geoffrey would still retain Brittany, as he was married to the ruler of Brittany, Constance, and for John, in addition to the lands he had in Cornwall and Gloucestershire, he would be granted the Duchy of Aquitaine. An easy-to-follow plan. There was just one problem. Richard had fought hard to control this unruly duchy for the last 8 years. He was not going to give it up after all that effort. Besides fighting to maintain the duchy, Richard had also given homage to his liege lord, the King of France. Henry's jurisdiction over the duchy had ended when he gave it to Richard, and for Richard, what would he gain? A hollow title perhaps, or a frustrating, lackluster role which Richard saw his elder brother struggle with. Richard would not concede the duchy, and he left his father's court for Poitou. At first, Henry's reaction to Richard's decision was tempered, even for a king whose anger and wrath were legendary when he didn't get his own way. But eventually, King Henry's short patience ran out, and he gave orders to Geoffrey and John to take the Duchy of Aquitaine by force. John's age at this point during the campaign into Aquitaine is a point of contention. Some of our sources give different ages for John, with the youngest age being 15 and the eldest 18. Regardless of John's age, Geoffrey would be the one to lead this force, and this would also be John's first military campaign. The initial plan to push Richard out failed, and Geoffrey and John resorted to conducting raids across Richard's lands. Richard responded in kind by launching his own harrying of Brittany. When word got to King Henry of his boys fighting, he summoned them to England to end the matter. And regardless of how the boys felt over journeying to England to meet face to face, the scary prospect of angering their father was enough for them to obey the summonings. Although Henry did use Eleanor as a bargaining chip to lure Richard. By February 1185, two incredibly important visitors arrived from the Holy Lands of Jerusalem to visit King Henry's court: the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Grand Master of the Knights, a testament to Henry's prestige and renown. The two men were here to acquire military aid, meeting the king at Reading, where King Henry's grandfather, Henry I, was entombed. During the meeting, the Patriarch begged the King of England for help, placing important symbols of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at his feet, including the standard of the kingdom, and beseeched Henry to take up the mantle and lead a military expedition to save the kingdom, a crusade. The whole assembly wept with the Patriarch, and the king himself was deeply moved. John himself sought to join this potential crusade, pleading with his father to take up the cross. King Henry refused John's request, as he had other plans for him in Ireland. Whatever King Henry's initial reaction to the plea, like any wise king, Henry sought the advice of his council. They met at London on March 18th, 1185. To summarize the meeting, they deemed that a crusade was not in the best interests of the Kingdom of England, also adding that the king's presence was always needed to establish stability in the realm. Relations for the next few months were peaceful. John would head to Ireland, having been granted lordship of Ireland, and would return in 1186. But in the same year, another shocking death to the sorrow of King Henry and Queen Eleanor. In August, Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, died in a tournament in Paris or of sudden illness. Not only was he grieved for by his parents, but also the King of France, Philip. He and Geoffrey were close friends. After Geoffrey's grand funeral, organised by the French king, the issues of the wardship of Geoffrey's two daughters and his unborn child became a centre point of conflict between Henry and Philip. Once again, John found himself near to the centre of his father's plans, and was only one sibling's death away from being the only male heir to the whole of the Angevin Empire. For John, the lordship of Ireland would fade into the background for now. The issue of Brittany and the wardship of Geoffrey's children lingered on, and soon started to turn into open warfare between Henry and Philip. Despite two peace conferences, which only achieved a few months of peace, and realistically was more time for each side to build up their forces. By the summer of 1187, King Philip was on the warpath. While these political affairs were ongoing, Geoffrey's widow, Constance, gave birth to a son named Arthur, a potential heir. As Richard was still unmarried and John had no children. After another failed peace conference, Henry organised the defence of his realm by ordering 4 war parties to be commanded by 4 lieutenants. One of Henry's bastard sons, Geoffrey the Bishop of Lincoln, John, Richard, and William de Mandeville, the Earl of Essex. Once again, the Angevins showed that by working together they could overcome any external threat, as both John and Richard moved their forces into the province of Berry in anticipation of Philip's forces, which soon arrived and besieged the town of Châteauroux. John and Richard saw to the defence of the town while King Henry marched his forces to aid his sons. It seemed a climactic battle was on the horizon. But instead of fighting, both sides sought diplomacy, as the danger of death in battle could see both sides potentially lose a king. 2 weeks of back and forth discussions ended with a truce that was to last for 2 years thanks to the clergy. With both parties satisfied, they went their separate ways, apart from Richard, who made the decision to leave with the King of France, despite after nearly fighting him. King Henry, after the initial shock, soon grew suspicious of Richard travelling with the French king. After all, 2 of his now deceased sons had allied with the French king in the past, so Henry was right to be suspicious. But all the quarrelling between father and son would soon fade with news from the Holy Lands. The Crusaders had been utterly defeated in battle against the forces of Saladin. Even worse news was to follow for the Christians. Jerusalem had been captured. Richard immediately swore to join a crusade. King Henry's reaction to Richard's declaration was not of anger but shock. It is alleged that for the next 4 days, after learning of Richard's intentions, he shut himself away from the world, speaking to no one, perhaps contemplating to himself over and over again what might happen if Richard was to leave, or worse, die during the crusade. It's unknown what John thought of the news, although Richard would later state he wanted John to travel with him on the crusade, which John may have agreed to given his earlier enthusiasm. But despite the ongoing rally cry for nobles to join the crusade and finance it, Henry and Philip were still at odds with each other, yet both monarchs were shamed into joining the crusade and took up the cross in early 1188. Yet when Richard demanded that John accompany him, Henry refused, leading Richard to believe, and encouraged by the French king, that Henry was seeking to disinherit him in favour of John. The nobles on the French side were eager to get the crusade going, as this quote from the Annals of Roger of Howden tells us. The Earl of Flanders, however, and Earl Theobald, and other earls and barons of the Kingdom of France laid down their arms, saying that they would never bear arms against Christians until they should have returned from their pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Richard, now firmly believing that his father planned to replace him with John as heir, sided with the French king and even performed homage to him for land still in Henry's control, forcing the issue of inheritance, as King Henry's succession plan was ambiguous, never outright stating that Richard was his heir. The situation deteriorated into a war between father and son. Once again, King Henry was to face a son and the French king together, but this would be the last time. In the spring of 1189, one final peace conference was held to avoid open hostilities. On the day of the conference, the King of France and the King of England, Earl Richard, the Cardinal John, and the 4 archbishops before mentioned, who had been chosen for the purpose, and the earls and barons of the 2 kingdoms, met for a conference near La Ferté-Bernard. At this conference, the King of France demanded of the King of England his sister Alice to be given in marriage to Richard, Earl of Poitou, and that fealty for his dominions should be sworn to the said Richard, and that his brother John, assuming the cross, should set out for Jerusalem. To this, the King of England made answer that he would never consent to such a proposal, and offered the King of France, if he should think fit, to assert thereto, to give the said Alice in marriage to his son John, with all the matters previously mentioned more at large, more fully and more completely than the king demanded. The King of France would not agree to this. With the negotiations failing, the French king left with Richard, and they quickly captured several castles around Le Mans. Henry, meanwhile, was resting at Le Mans, becoming increasingly ill. And before long, Philip's army was preparing to assault the walls of the city. Yet, in one case, either the defenders or the governor of Anjou set fires to the outskirts of the city to hold off the invading army. But the fire was blown back further into the city. The French army then moved towards a stone bridge, which Henry's smaller army tried to pull down. A bloody clash was fought on the bridge, with heavy death tolls on both sides. Henry's bastard son Geoffrey was wounded in the thigh and captured. The bloody attack by the French broke through, and what remained of Henry's army hurriedly fled into the city, with the French army pursuing them. Henry had promised the citizens that he would never abandon the city of which his father is laid to rest, as well as his own birthplace. But the situation was desperate for Henry, and to avoid certain capture or death, he had to flee the city with a small force of mounted knights. The French army gave chase, but were checked by a deep ford in the river. Henry fled to Chinon. As for John, there is no mention of him or what he was up to. As Henry fled, his rearguard was commanded by William Marshal. While covering the retreat, William faced Richard on horseback. The encounter went as the following. William brought down his spear and charged at Richard. Richard cried out, "God's feet, Marshal, slay me not, I have no hauberk." William responded while charging, "Slay you? No, I leave that to the devil." Immediately after shouting this, William thrusted his spear into Richard's horse's neck, killing it. With the horse dead, William left Richard behind, mountless. Back to King Henry. After a few miles of galloping, Henry and his men rested upon a hill overlooking the now burning city. Henry is reported to have said the following: "O God, thou hast shamefully taken from me this day the city which I loved most on earth, in which I was born and bred, where lies the body of my father and that of his patron saint. I requite thee as I can. I will withdraw from thee that thing in me for which thou carest the most." After a period of rest, Henry's plan was to head to Normandy to gather more troops to continue the fight. Yet, along the way, Henry suddenly turned around and headed back towards Anjou, to the surprise of his retinue. He was ill and perhaps felt like he was dying and wanted the comforts of home or nearest to it. Avoiding enemy forces along the way, Henry made it to Chinon, exhausted from illness and the summer heat. Meanwhile, Philip and Richard were making lightning progress in capturing towns and castles, while Henry lay dying in bed, and by July the 3rd, Henry met the two. Richard had not believed the tales of his father being deathly ill, but upon seeing how weak and fragile his father was, felt remorse. Henry was now being supported on horseback by two servants. Shocked by this, Philip and Richard offered a cloak to be laid upon the ground for the weary monarch to rest on. King Henry refused the offer and demanded what terms they wanted to present, as Henry was in no position to refuse. After agreeing to the terms, Henry is said to have whispered into Richard's ear during the kiss of peace, "God, grant that I may not die until I have had my revenge on you." Before Henry left, he asked a list to be drawn up with the names of those who left him for Philip or Richard. The Chronicles of Roger of Hoveden give us one story of what happened next. This being accordingly done, he found the name of his son John written at the beginning of the list. Surprised at this beyond measure, he came to Chinon and, touched with grief at heart, cursed the day on which he was born, and pronounced upon his sons the curse of God and of himself, which he would never withdraw, although bishops and other religious men frequently admonished him so to do. Being sick even until death, he ordered himself to be carried into the church, before the altar, and there devoutly received the communion of the body and blood of Christ. And after confessing his sins and being absolved by the bishop and clergy, he departed this life in the 35th year of his reign, on the octave of the apostles St. Peter and St. Paul, being the 5th day of the week, after a reign of 34 years, 7 months and 4 days. King Henry was one of the greatest monarchs of the High Middle Ages, embodying the quintessential traits and personality of what defines a High Middle Ages king. His last 2 legitimate sons only contained half of what made their father a successful medieval monarch, and his curse upon his sons would come true. Whoever saw such a heavy oppressor of the church, so unjust a tyrant to his kingdom, and one to obstinate in almost everything evil, enjoying so great and incomparable a victory, as if everything he did had been well and honourably done. With the death of King Henry II of England, John is only one sibling's death away from inheriting the whole of the Angevin Empire. As fragile as the collection of one county and several duchies beholden to the French king are, Richard's reputation and martial prowess enabled him to rein in any rebels or disgruntled barons hoping to challenge the new king, which would be a trivial task for the now warrior king. Richard would be setting his sights and the financial resources of his empire into motion for the Third Crusade, along with the King of France, while also finding a role for his brother John to keep him out of trouble within Richard's new realm. King Henry II had many enemies over the course of his reign, and defeated all of them. Only his family were able to finally bring him down over the years. Richard would inherit such enemies, but only one rival family member to deal with, John. Yet, the most pressing issue for Richard was to restore the king's peace and bury his father. A few tales tell us that when Richard approached his father's body, blood flowed from his nose, which is interpreted as a sign of anger towards Richard from Henry's body. Or in terms of Middle Ages science, the 4 bodily humours were out of balance. Richard probably wasn't too bothered by this, and maybe the odd crocodile tear. Richard forgave any transgressions towards him from King Henry's most loyal men, including the famed William Marshal, who could have killed him not too long ago. By July the 20th, 1189, Richard was in Normandy, securing the title of Duke there, before meeting his liege lord and now major rival, King Philip of France. As for John, he was in Normandy for his brother's ascension. Richard's opinion of John at this point in time was indifference, seeing John as nothing more than the younger brother who was still learning the ways of the world, as John was only 20 but still had the potential to be useful, as John hadn't really developed the reputation as we know of. John swapping sides from his father to his brothers was just seeing the writing on the wall. Most nobles of the realm would do this and did. Richard would honour the agreements that his father had made for John, with lands in England and Normandy, and finally allowing John to marry Isabella of Gloucester. John gained lucrative chunks of land, including the port of Bristol. The only inconvenience John encountered was that his lands became under an interdict by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He objected to the kinship between John and Isabella, due to them both being great-grandchildren of Henry I. John appealed against the Archbishop. He wasn't going to let a clergyman stand in his way of gaining substantial lands and revenue. John might have known the match with Isabella was designed to limit his options in marriage, yet there was no harmony in the bedroom, no children produced. So John could use these reasons when the time became convenient to annul the marriage and marry someone else. And if he wanted some loving, he already had some, as he may have had over 7 illegitimate children prior to his coronation. And to add a little bit of humour, William of Newburgh, a 12th century chronicler, said that for a young king to remain celibate was a greater miracle than raising someone from the dead. So while John obtained a fair amount of power, there was more to gain if Richard were to die. And going on a crusade, there was a good chance of that, most likely from disease. Although, as we've discovered, Richard had a terrible habit of not wearing his armour. John's position as heir was almost solid. There was only one other contender, Arthur, Duke of Brittany. And if he was to become king, well. However, the boy was only 2 years old by 1189, and as we've mentioned, childhood mortality in the Middle Ages was high. So until Arthur became older, he wasn't considered a threat by John. Richard's main concern now was being crowned King of England and raising funds for the crusade. Richard and John set sail for England, with Richard arriving in Portsmouth and John landing at Dover. Their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had been released from her house arrest and greeted Richard on his arrival. The people of England were feeling a sense of wonder and optimism for the future, as Roger of Hoveden, an eyewitness to Richard's coronation, states, and thus, the son becoming greater and greater, enlarged the good works of his father, while the bad ones he cut short. Personality-wise, Richard was very much like his father, quick to fits of anger if he didn't get his way, and in some cases suffering from vanity, but also temperate, especially when dealing with John. King Richard's coronation began on the 3rd of September 1189 at Westminster Abbey. Roger of Hoveden has given us an eyewitness account of how a 12th century coronation worked. Richard would be anointed with oil and promised to defend the people and uphold the laws and customs of the land and church. John's role here was the carrier of a ceremonial sword. After the coronation, Richard's administration entered a flurry of activity, of raising funds for the crusade, with a particular tax called the Saladin tithe, filling the coffers quite effectively, along with the sales of titles and rights, which included selling Scotland back to the King of Scots. Another aspect Richard had to fix in place was the power of his government, as his kingdom would be without its king for a number of years, and Richard needed to delegate power appropriately. One figure Richard could always trust was his mother, Eleanor. As for John, he was assisting his brother on orders to quell and make peace with the Welsh princes. John besieged Carmarthen Castle in order to bring some Welsh princes to the negotiation table. Relations between the brothers by the end of 1189 seemed at least somewhat cordial. Richard granted more lands to John, including one of the finest lordships of England, that of Wallingford. Before leaving England for Normandy, Richard left two men in charge of England, William de Mandeville, the Earl of Essex, and Hugh, Bishop of Durham. Yet the Earl of Essex died not long after his appointment, and was replaced by Richard's clerk, now declared Chancellor, William Longchamp. Longchamp's conduct in his time in office was one of a tyrant, arguing with his peers and imprisoning others. Longchamp would make enemies quickly, including John. By February 1190, John was in Normandy, answering a summons from Richard. John was joined by his half-brother, Geoffrey. Richard had heard the news of his top men in government arguing and grappling for power. Richard's mind was set on removing Hugh, the Bishop of Durham, from his shared position of power with Longchamp, and making John and Geoffrey swear on a Bible not to enter England for at least 3 years. Again, John hadn't done anything yet to earn this sudden distrust from his brother. Some sources blame Longchamp, others are undecided. John agreed to this demand. He wasn't in any position to refuse his brother, the king. But their mother, with a sense of reason, lessened the restriction of the oath, and John was allowed to enter England at the behest of Longchamp. The political situation in England was still tense and delicate, but to Richard's mind, he was satisfied and sidestepped the issues in favour of the crusade. And by the summer of 1190, Richard was on his way along with the French king, although the two would travel separately and meet in various locations across Europe. While Richard was travelling, we don't have much information on what John was up to until November of 1190, when news reached John that Richard had declared Arthur his heir. Richard had done this in order to secure alliances within regions of his French territories. In the time that Richard had left for the crusade, Longchamp wasted no time in securing his position in England, trying to secure alliances and building his power base by fortifying castles he controlled, including the Tower of London. Longchamp still possessed the confidence of the king, and was seeking to protect himself further by supporting Richard's choice of heir. John's reaction to these events was to build his own alliances in a coalition against Longchamp, as Longchamp's actions towards John were becoming more hostile. He had taken castles under the pretext of his authority as protector of the realm. Longchamp had even started hostilities towards William Marshal. Richard was kept in the loop with letters, but he was still busy with the crusade and recovering from a horrible illness. By the campaigning season of 1191, after another, surprise, failed peace conference, siege warfare began at Lincoln Castle. The castle was under the control of one of John's allies, and Longchamp was abusing his power by trying to obtain the castle under weak reasons. Longchamp had overestimated his military might, while John was building his forces around England. Longchamp, realizing that John might attack his forces while they were entrenched, retreated. By now, Richard was well aware of the troubles in England. and sent Walter of Coutances to resolve the issues in Richard's government. John and Longchamp were at each other's throats, with accusations against each other. Winchester was to be the place of vicious discussions in order to bring peace to England. This is where we see the famous Angevin anger, this time from John, who became enraged at the suggestion he broke the oath of entering England without permission. The meeting was tense, with both John and Longchamp having troops stationed nearby in case the talks failed. Luckily for the people of England, a treaty that both sides agreed upon was drawn up and ratified, with castles being exchanged and Longchamp agreeing to support John over Arthur as heir. Yet Longchamp soon proved true the accusations of him acting as a tyrant by arresting, after a 5-day siege, John's half-brother, Archbishop Geoffrey, who had returned to England, breaking his oath. Yet the arrest and treatment of Geoffrey began to eerily sound incredibly similar to the tale of Thomas Becket. As horrible as what happened to Geoffrey is, we can imagine John may have had a smirk on his face. This was a golden opportunity to oust Longchamp. John sent letters to the major political players in England to meet at the London Bridge. John was acting as a peacekeeper, but Longchamp failed to meet the assembled council, and the situation began to deteriorate into conflict as one of Longchamp's knights killed one of John's. Longchamp lost his nerve again and fled to the Tower of London. John and his council of nobles and clergymen were here to restore the king's peace. After all, John was acting on behalf of his brother, and a letter from Richard, which was given to William Marshal and the Archbishop of Rouen, essentially stated that if his chancellor abused his position and power, then he was to be removed. John had shown enough leadership and loyalty to his brother that he managed to secure the confidence and support of a good portion of the clergy and barons of England, plus the people of London, to be proclaimed heir. But we will soon see John squander that goodwill. In one story, Longchamp was shocked at the news of being deposed and tried to escape London dressed as a woman. But as he spoke no English, he didn't get far. Yet Longchamp would not accept his disposition, and he planned to strike back. After all, he was not just the right-hand man of King Richard, but also a papal legate, meaning he had the political power of the Pope at his back. But he lacked friends in England, something he realized he needed to rectify, which, in a bizarre, bold act, he tried to befriend John. Now this is when we begin to see one of the darker aspects of John's character develop: greed. At the end of 1191, the King of France had returned from the Crusade. Philip would take advantage of Richard's absence and of John's lack of political astuteness. As we've been exploring John's story, we haven't yet come across what actions and personal traits which presented him as the villain and evil king within the public conscience. But that's about to change. John's hunger for power and wealth led him to act rashly and politically stupid, especially with his dealings with the French king, and would become a major problem for King Richard, who already had enough problems during the Third Crusade. For example, illness, raids, shipworms, etc. Yet, despite these problems, King Richard had developed his reputation as a crusader and effective military commander that set his place in history. but at the same time making enough enemies among his fellow Christians that Richard's return home would become incredibly arduous, and John would try and take full advantage of this. In December 1191, John was spending Christmas in Yorkshire. The hot topic of conversation was obviously the Crusade, but in particular, the French king's return from the Crusade. Philip had returned for various reasons, and depending on whose chronicles you read, can be interpreted as Philip reneging on his promise to liberate Jerusalem, or wisely returning due to the state of France or illness. There are numerous reasons as to why Philip returned, although the illness which both he and Richard suffered from sounded horrible. The two kings seemingly suffered from the same disease, referred to as Leonardi or Arnoldia, thought to be trench mouth, otherwise Vincent's disease, or perhaps scurvy. Philip had a strong fever, which caused him to tremble. The disease caused the hair and nails to fall out, the body to swell, lips to become sore, and skin to peel off in strips. Before returning to France, King Philip met with the Pope and received his blessing to break off from the crusade. King Philip gave the Pope a rundown of what was happening and the difficulties he had working with Richard, with both men arguing over various issues. Although, as we've mentioned, the traits the Angevin King shared, one being a short temper. In one tale, Richard and his men were play fighting with King Philip's men in Messina, using reed canes in a mock sword fight. Richard fought against William de Bar on horseback. William hit Richard on the head, breaking his headpiece. Richard became incandescent with rage and leapt at William, but failed twice to bring him off his horse. After the fight simmered down, Richard, according to Roger of Hoveden, shouted,
"Away with you, Hans, and take care that you never appear in my presence again, for at heart I shall be for everlasting the enemy of you and yours."
Now that King Philip was back in France, despite looking bold, lame, and neurotic, he wasted no time in undermining King Richard and preparing to strike at the Angevin Empire. Although a risky venture to attack a fellow crusader away fighting for the Christian God, to King Philip, Richard deserved it. On a personal issue Philip had against Richard was his promise to marry his sister Alice. Yet Alice was initially a ward under Richard's father, Henry II. She eventually became one of Henry's many mistresses and even bore him a son. So it's understandable why Richard may not have wanted to marry Alice, and he paid Philip handsomely in marks as a form of an apology. But Philip was insulted and added the insult to the list of transgressions from the Angevins. And by January 1192, King Philip was picking a fight with the Normans and demanded from the Seneschal of Normandy to hand over his sister Alice and some lands which would have been part of her dowry. A reasonable request. Yet the Normans stated they could not do or act in any way without permission from their Duke, King Richard. Frustrated by this, King Philip would have normally waged war, but a combination of Richard's developing crusade reputation and the French baron's refusal left King Philip to take a more guile and politically savvy approach, allying with John. John's position in this political game is an interesting one. For starters, he managed to elevate himself into a position of influence and power within England by working against the tyrant, disgraced former Lord Chancellor William Longchamp. John's reputation in England at this point in time was positive. The people of London saw him as the good brother of the king. Yet John didn't have as much power as he would have liked to, as the authority of the kingdom was in the hands of the Archbishop of Rouen, Walter. All John could do was see to the running of his estates and wait for news from the crusade. John was in a state of limbo. He would be king if his brother died, but replaced as heir if Richard had a son, which could be seen as likely, as Richard was now married to Berengaria of Navarre. So when John obtained an invitation from King Philip to come to France and marry his sister Alice, along with helping John to usurp Richard from his lands in France, John became filled with enthusiasm and jumped at the chance. However, John's ambition was quickly curbed by his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor had arrived in England by February 1192, and with the Archbishop of Rouen called together several meetings of barons and clergy across parts of England, all to renew oaths of loyalty to King Richard, and in contrast also to John as heir. But John was warned by his mother not to leave England, as if he did, then his estates would be forfeited. John stayed in England, but he didn't sulk. Instead, he turned his attention to fortifying his position in England and gaining more power and leverage by taking control of two astonishingly important castles in England. Wallingford, a key castle during the anarchy where Empress Matilda, John's grandmother, held for years, and Windsor, the seat of power for the monarchy, which John's father had greatly rebuilt and reinforced. Remarkably, John managed to acquire and garrison both without any threat of conflict, perhaps through simple persuasion. John had now elevated himself into a more powerful position, with two of the finest castles in all of England under his control. The key players in King Richard's government were fearful of John taking castles, as only the king had the power to grant castles. The situation for the council was precarious. King Richard's authority was paramount, and John was challenging it. But at the same time, John was heir, an awkward scenario. Yet worse news was to come with the arrival of the former Lord Chancellor, William Longchamp. He was back with the support of the Pope. After all, he was a papal legate, and he may have paid a bribe to John and Eleanor. The council running England whirled away from their hostilities towards John and begged him to save them from Longchamp, as some were now excommunicated. John must have felt a supreme sense of power, residing at Wallingford. Whoever became the highest bidder would gain John's favour, as John is stated to have said. This Chancellor does not in the least fear the threats or seek the friendship of any or all of you. If he can have only my favour alone, he is to give me £700 of silver within the week, if I will not meddle between you and him. You see, I need the money. The council soon enough paid John his dues. After all, he had saved the kingdom once again from the tyranny of Longchamp. John was just conducting business as his father and brother had done. Yet even worse news arrived for the council in England and the Angevin Empire as a whole. King Richard had been captured on his return from the Third Crusade, not by the forces of Saladin, but in Austria. Duke Leopold, himself a fellow crusader, held a grudge against Richard. After his capture, Richard was taken into the custody of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. The imprisonment of a crusader, especially one of the leaders, was the hot news around Europe, and while King Richard was in prison composing top 10 hits, his kingdom and lands were charged with raising a huge amount of funds to free their king. After a few years of raising enormous amounts of revenue for the Third Crusade. This is where we will see one of the major black marks on John's reputation: betrayal. John was in a prime position to join forces with King Philip. John controlled a powerful assortment of castles in England, which could hold out for years, and had in the case of Wallingford. John learned of his brother's imprisonment at Cardiff in January 1193, and he soon travelled to Normandy with his retinue. Along the way towards Paris, John tried to put forward the case to the lords of Richard's French lands that he should be recognised as their lord. The lords quickly turned John down and reaffirmed their loyalty to Richard. John reached Paris and soon came to an agreement with the French king, performing homage and other diplomatic treaties. John and Philip soon planned an invasion of England by hiring Flemish troops, while in England, John's castles were under siege. The treaty that John had made with the French king was unquestionably stupid and deeply favourable to King Philip, giving him good chunks of Normandy, something John's ancestors had held since Rollo and the Northmen settled there, as well as cities around the Angevin Empire. John had given the French king an easy victory that would have required years of military conflict if Richard was around. And by the end of March, John had managed to arrive safely in England, causing a civil war in the process, and tried to convince potential allies that Richard was dead. He failed, but a peace talk was successfully held by the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, and thanks to his loyal men and his mother, the ransom money for King Richard was raised, and Richard was soon to be released. John and Philip soon started to panic. When Richard returned, what horrible fate awaited John. He dared not step foot into England and stayed in France, and by the time the two brothers met again, under the supervision of their mother in 1194, John had only one course of action: prostrate himself and beg for forgiveness, an utter personal humiliation. One source seeks to dramatize the event further, the history of William Marshall, by stating that King Richard said the following after John came whimpering out from another room.
John, have no fear. You are a child, and you had bad men looking after you.
John would spend the next year politically destitute and financially poorer. A subject rarely mentioned when discussing King John is his time in Ireland, both as a young man and later as King of England in 1210. In this episode, we will be focusing on King John when he visited Ireland as a young man in 1185 to assert his claims as King of Ireland, and in 1210 when he returns to deal with rebel barons and obtain more agreements with the Irish kings. To give a brief background to Ireland in the High Middle Ages, Ireland is unique compared to England, Scotland and Wales, but also similar in certain aspects. One example of the differences in the Middle Ages is the concept of marriage. A divorce was far easier to obtain as opposed to across the sea. And instead of Irish kings just having mistresses, polygamy, at least for the Irish nobility, was something they readily partook in, much to the horror of the Catholic Church. Yet one aspect of political life common in both Ireland and Britain was the running of government. Kings still issued charters of lands and laws, but there was also canon law in relation to the church. which before the Anglo-Norman invasion, the Irish churches were independent, with a lot of churches across Ireland not under any direct jurisdiction. Unlike in England, where the Canterbury See held great influence and authority over other churches in Britain. Laws and land givings were done by the king, which Ireland had many. But there is one title unique to Ireland, the High King of Ireland. The title of High King of Ireland dates back centuries, and is mixed in with myths and legends on the early kings of Ireland. By the time of the 12th century, the title was ceremonial, a badge of prestige to acquire, a title to fight for. A powerful Irish king could attempt to acquire the title. Other than prestige, there were no other benefits. To summarise Ireland in the late 12th century with a quote, Ireland in 1185 was a complex place, politically, culturally, and linguistically. Now that we've given a brief background for 12th century Ireland, we can now focus on how John tried to become King of Ireland and later Lord of Ireland. But first, we need to explore how the Angevins started to turn their attention to Ireland. When the Normans had conquered England in 1066, Ireland had always been somewhat in their sights, but other affairs had taken attention away from a planned invasion. Yet, the first Angevin King of England, a descendant of the Normans, King Henry II, had taken an interest in Ireland. The story goes that Henry wanted to give his younger brother Ireland as his own kingdom or as a vassalage. This idea goes back to 1155, which at this point in King Henry's reign was only the start. He had been King of England for less than a year, and his new vast empire wasn't secure. To head start an invasion of Ireland would require vast sums of cash, resources, and manpower. The Irish Sea was also its own obstacle, plus the Irish themselves were no pushovers. The planned invasion was shelved. Ireland would fade into the background for the Angevin king for now. The next time Ireland came to the attention of King Henry was in 1166, when the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough, was ousted from his throne by an alliance led by one of the most powerful Irish kings, Rory O'Connor, King of Connacht, and now High King of Ireland. Dermot soon travelled to meet King Henry in Aquitaine. To quote the Irish historian R.F. Foster on how this changed Irish history. He appealed for help to Henry II and changed the course of Irish history by doing so. The invitation inevitably became an invasion. Like most great changes in history, it was an accident, unforeseen and unplanned, which opened up Ireland politically to expansive Anglo-French feudalism, as England and Scotland had been. Ireland would have been drawn into that feudal world eventually, closer to its neighbour and trading partner, and would have received feudal colonists, but no doubt in a different way. Ironically, the emerging Irish political unity destroyed itself just when it appeared to be successful. King Henry himself wouldn't go directly to Ireland to assist Dermot, but Dermot could return with support as a vassal to King Henry, performing homage to the English king for his kingdom. A surefire way of getting the Anglo-Normans on your side was the chance to acquire more land, and Dermot found allies in Wales from the Marcher Lords, Normans who had settled and conquered parts of Wales. One earl would become a leading figure in the invasion of Ireland, Richard de Clare, nicknamed Strongbow. By 1171, Dermot was dead. Strongbow and other barons had made significant progress in conquering parts of Ireland, such as Leinster and Meath. However, they became too successful in the eyes of King Henry. Strongbow's position in Ireland was becoming more and more powerful, and to curb this growing power, King Henry and his government organised an army. As the Annals of Ulster state, there came into Ireland Henry, son of the Empress, most puissant King of England, and also Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine and Count of Anjou, and Lord of many other lands, with 240 ships. So that was the first advent of the Saxons into Ireland, and he came to land at Portlargy and received the pledges of Munster. He came after that to Dublin and received the pledges of Leinster and of the men of Meath. When it comes to King John's first trip to Ireland as a young man and the son of the king to enforce and receive submissions from the Irish kings, our secondary sources come to various conclusions on the success of the first venture in 1185. One of the primary sources of information during this first trip comes from the Topography of Ireland by Gerald of Wales, written in 1187, as well as the Conquest of Ireland in 1189. The first manuscript is a fascinating read, giving vivid details on all aspects of Ireland in the late 12th century, from politics to the animals, sea, rivers, land, etc. However, it does contain anti-Irish sentiment, which would later be used as one of the justifications for the continued conquest of Ireland down the centuries. To quote a small part, "This island is also especially remarkable for a great number of beautiful lakes, abounding in fish, and surpassing in size those of any other countries I have visited, on the people of Ireland. But although they are richly endowed with the gifts of nature, their want of civilization, shown both in their dress and mental culture, makes them a barbarous people, for they wear but little woolen, and nearly all they use is black, that being the colour of the sheep in this country. Their clothes are also made after a barbarous fashion." Gerald further comments, "The Irish are a rude people, subsisting on the produce of their cattle only, and living themselves like beasts." And my personal favourite part to lighten the mood, I have also heard it said by merchants who pursued their adventures in the ocean that on some occasions, having unloaded their ships in an Irish port, they found toads in the bottom of the hold, and having thrown them on shore in a living state, they immediately turned on their backs and, bursting their bellies, died, to the astonishment of many who witnessed it. It appears, therefore, that either through the merits of the saints, as report goes throughout the world, or some strange and unheard of, but most kindly, influence of the air, or some occult property of the soil, itself inimical to poison, no venomous animal can exist here, and every kind of poison introduced from other countries forthwith loses its malignant effect. Indeed, the soil of Ireland is so hostile to poison that, if gardens or any other spots in foreign countries are sprinkled with its dust, all venomous reptiles are immediately driven far away. John would leave for Ireland in 1185, after being knighted by his father, or a few weeks after. King Henry had already set the groundwork for John with the Treaty of Windsor, an agreement between King Henry and High King Rory O'Connor. This would be John's first major test as a future ruler, although if we looked at the account of Gerald of Wales, who accompanied John to Ireland, the story would read as an unmitigated disaster for John. His first enterprise of sending his son John into Ireland, which had cost him so much fruitless toil and expense, failed and came to nothing. This isn't the case, as we have grants of lands issued by John that suggest it's more complex than simply discarding the whole adventure as came to nothing. Plus, John did have a challenge on his hands, not only dealing with the Irish, but also the Anglo-Norman lords who had conquered large parts of Ireland. They had effectively ruled their new lands without any direct control from the King of England, and were a force of political nature within their territories, something John would have to overcome. But John didn't help himself. One of the first acts that is mentioned in the primary source is that when John and his retinue met some of the Irish chieftains, who had great long beards, the Irish chiefs were mocked and belittled, even having their beards tugged. This was more than a diplomatic faux pas, but considering how the Anglo-Normans had treated the Irish and complained about how they were poor Christians, it's not surprising how John and his retinue acted. The Anglo-Normans were here to conquer Ireland, and one way of controlling an area in the Middle Ages is by building castles. John did just this, ordering the construction of 3 strategic castles. The incoming colonists were to build towns, roads and other industrial places in Ireland around Waterford, Carrickfergus, Cork and Dublin. English, Welsh and the Flemish all came to work in Ireland, while the Irish were marginalised and gradually pushed into less desirable locations. A chronicler from this time period, William of Newburgh, who either intentionally or unintentionally writes a poignant remark about the freedom of the Irish. This marked the end of freedom for the Irish people, a people who had been free since time immemorial. They had not been conquered by the Romans, but now they fell into the power of the King of England. John would provide a major step in the conquest of Ireland by his actions in 1185, not only building castles, but providing the opportunity to those in his retinue by giving them lands not yet conquered. John Lackland, son of the King of the Saxons, came into Ireland 60 ships strong or something more, besides what was before him of foreigners in Ireland. John had come to Ireland with some of the best men within King Henry's government, and his own young entourage, who he would favour during this trip by issuing land grants to various friends. One friend, Theobald Walter, was given a large chunk of land in Limerick if he could convince the Irish to part with it, using the sword. The family of the Butlers, Bergs and Verduns all gained land because of John, and these families would be working for the English as administrative heads for a long time, as opposed to just letting the Anglo-Normans take what they could without any oversight. The city of Dublin, originally founded by the Vikings, would be John's main base and would further develop into a trade asset for John through the ports in Bristol. While John's actions in Ireland in 1185 would bear fruit in years later, his lack of political guile and diplomacy would lead to problems during his first venture. Although Strongbow had died years before John's arrival, there were other powerful lords. Hugh de Lacy. He had worked himself into a powerful position, even marrying the daughter of the High King of Ireland, Rory O'Connor, who, by the time of John's arrival, had retired. Hugh and the other Anglo-Norman lords would be vexed at John giving lands to others in his retinue over them, which further proved an ill move in the short term, but as mentioned, proved fruitful in the future. But the worst mistake John made was insulting the Irish lords and kings. John hadn't received any submissions from the Irish kings or chiefs during his first time in Ireland, whereas his father was far more successful. In essence, John and his retinue became a third party in the political climate of 12th century Ireland. The Irish were striking back, attacking the borders of the Anglo-Norman territories, and John is alleged to not have paid his troops, causing desertion. By the end of the campaigning season, John had left Ireland. When we first started this series, we looked at King John's personality and hobbies. But one thing we didn't mention was how Ireland influenced King John, in particular how he handled hostages. By the time of King John's second trip to Ireland in 1210, he had developed a reputation of breaking his word, as well as hostages being murdered or disappearing. King John had always demanded hostages to keep his barons in check. This was a common practice of the time to keep the peace or maintain agreements. Yet King John may have taken inspiration from how the Irish lords dealt with hostages, by killing them, sometimes harshly, for breaking the peace. It was common practice to kill hostages routinely in Ireland. King John also enjoyed judicial duels, watching men fight to the death. This quote explains just how John became a unique beast. John was perhaps that most remarkable, indeed unique of creatures, a king of England first trained to kingship in Ireland. The problem for his subjects was not that John failed to organise effective lordship for the Irish. The problem was that John became too Irish for his French or English subjects to bear. King John's next journey to Ireland in 1210 was due to dealing with barons who had overstepped in King John's mind. Ireland had become the ideal refuge point for barons who had either fallen out with the king or wanted to escape King John's policies. Ireland was fast becoming a brewing pot of discontent against King John, something he would crush with his fullest power. By 1210, King John was still gathering his resources and planning to take back his French lands, which he had lost to King Philip. But despite these losses, King John had consolidated such a strong position in Britain that we could argue that this was King John at his most powerful, before he lost it all at the Battle of Bouvines. One baron in particular had incurred King John's wrath, William de Braouse. At one point was one of King John's favourite men, yet in King John's account the two had fallen out over money and was forced into a provocation by William. Yet William himself did start a failed uprising in Wales and attacked castles within the king's control. This is all from King John's own account. It also didn't help that William's wife had called out King John for murdering his nephew, Arthur, Duke of Brittany. With that, William and his family fled to Ireland. King John had brought the power of his kingdom to bear, assembling 700 ships, something not seen since William the Conqueror invaded England. The building of this huge force was enough to make even the most powerful barons seek peace. Even the famed William Marshal knew he had to make peace with the king. King John achieved rapid success in Ireland in 1210, taking Carrickfergus Castle after a short siege, as well as making agreements with the Irish kings and defeating his Anglo-Norman barons. But King John's new positive relationship with some Irish kings fell apart quickly due to King John's insistence on hostages, important ones such as heirs, something, as we know, King John could not be trusted with, and would become a major issue when the barons had cornered a weakened King John at Runnymede with the Magna Carta. To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. The reign of King John lasted from 1199 to 1216 and saw enormous changes in England, France and Ireland. The Angevin Empire, a collection of duchies and a kingdom, would collapse under King John, the last Angevin king. As we've been covering his life up until King Richard the Lionheart's return from captivity and explored how Ireland influenced John's kingship, we can now focus on his entire reign, from inheriting a vast complex of titles to losing half of England to rebel barons who supported a French prince, ironically nicknamed the Lion, and the creation of one of the most significant charters in English history, the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, which, in its first form, failed spectacularly and became one of the causes of the First Barons' War in England, to which King John would not see the end of. But first, we need to go back to the year 1199. By 1199, Duke John had developed a reputation of breaking his word as well as betraying his brother, King Richard. Despite showing promise during the Longchamp crisis in England, John had quickly lost any goodwill from that situation, and by the time of King Richard's return from his imprisonment, John became politically isolated. He had to work hard to gain any trust back, and he did work well for his brother, leading military campaigns on his behalf, giving King Richard at least some hope John might be more loyal and useful in the future. But now King Richard was back, there was no reason to doubt he would soon produce an heir, leaving John as the obscure brother in the background. Yet, King Richard never saw John as a threat. In Richard's eyes, John was still the naive, incompetent child who would cower at the first sign of aggression. Besides, King Richard was a busy man with a vast empire to run, castles to build, and dealing with an ambitious liege lord, the King of France, Philip. In March 1199, during a typical siege against an unruly viscount, King Richard continued his bad habit of not wearing his armour. Roger of Howden's account describes the event. When the King of England and Marchades were reconnoitring the castle on all sides and examining in which spot it would be most advisable to make the assault, a certain arbalister, Bertram de Gurdam by name, aimed an arrow from the castle and struck the king on the arm, inflicting an incurable wound. The king, on being wounded, mounted his horse and rode to his quarters, and issued orders to Marchades and the whole of the army to make assaults on the castle without intermission, until it should be taken, which was accordingly done. After its capture, the king ordered all the people to be hanged, him alone excepted who had wounded him, whom, as we may reasonably suppose, he would have condemned to a most shocking death if he had recovered. After this, the king gave himself into the hands of a physician of his captain, who, after attempting to extract the iron head, extracted the wood only, while the iron remained in the flesh. But after this butcher had carelessly mangled the king's arm in every part, he at last extracted the arrow. When the king was now in despair of surviving, he devised to his brother John the kingdom of England and all his other territories, and ordered fealty to be done to the aforesaid John by those who were present, and commanded that his castles should be delivered to him, and 3/4 of his treasure. All his jewels he devised to his nephew, Otto, the King of Germany, and the 4th part of his treasure he ordered to be distributed among his servants and the poor. He then ordered Bertram de Gurdon, who had wounded him, to come into his presence, and said to him,
"What harm have I done to you, that you have killed me?"
On which he made answer, "You slew my father and my 2 brothers with your own hand, and you had intended now to kill me. Therefore, take any revenge on me that you may think fit, for I will readily endure the greatest torment you can devise, so long as you have met with your end, after having inflicted evils so many and so great upon the world." On this, the king ordered him to be released, and said,
"I forgive you my death."
But the youth stood before the feet of the king, and with scowling features and undaunted neck did his courage demand the sword. The king was aware that punishment was wished for, and that pardon was dreaded.
"Live on,"
said he,
"although thou art unwilling, and by my bounty behold the light of day."
to the conquered faction now let there be bright hopes, and the example of myself. And then, after being released from his chains, he was allowed to depart, and the king ordered 100 shillings of English money to be given to him. Merihodes, however, the king, not knowing of it, seized him, and after the king's death, first flaying him alive, had him hanged. King Richard the Lionheart had died on the 6th of April 1199, and normally when a medieval king dies, the nobles use the lull in royal authority to settle old scores, or just try and simply secure their positions of power. For John, his political position is unclear. A few months before King Richard had died, King Philip is alleged to have shown Richard a document and claimed that John had once again backstabbed Richard and pledged to support King Philip. Richard, angered by this, once again stripped John of all his lands and titles. But depending on the chroniclers' accounts, John defended himself with evidence and was restored to royal favour. Yet another account states that John remained dispossessed until King Richard died of his wounds. Roger of Howden's account is the funniest, mentioning the event by calling King Philip sower of discord and remarking on the whole affair as a thing much to be wondered at. But for John, now inheriting the vast Angevin Empire, which, despite its glamorous title, had cracks within it, as there was a disconnect within the empire and a growing sense of disunity, which John didn't have the political skills to fix, and would be a challenge for anyone suddenly thrust into kingship. But the situation was brewing into a vile mixture of existing issues, political, financial, and John's own egregious personality. Even before King John's ascension, there were cracks forming. One example, in 1196, the Bishop of Lincoln, Hugh, refused to send English knights for a military campaign abroad by stating, "I am well aware that the Church of Lincoln is bound to do the King's military service, but only in this country. Outside the boundaries of England, no such thing is owed." For John, he was about to inherit an empire which had grown strong under his father and stable but cracking under his brother. The constant conflicts which Richard had led, the demands of the cost of warfare, as well as the crusade and the ransom for Richard, left the Angevin Empire financially poorer. John would also now have to contend with an emboldened King Philip, who held the desire to break the Angevin Empire. Yet John's biggest rival was a member of his own family, his nephew, Arthur, Duke of Brittany. The news of King Richard's death took time to reach all over the Angevin Empire. King Richard succumbed to his wound 11 days after the injury, giving him time to contemplate who should succeed him, as he had named Arthur and John as heir various times over the course of his reign. With Richard dead, whomever would inherit came down to different factors: the location of the heirs, the powerful barons who, with their support, could help secure the empire, and in England's case, the weather. Crossing the English Channel was always dangerous. One of the most important assets to secure was the treasury. Luckily for John, he was already backed up by some of the most powerful nobles in England and in Normandy. There were issues with Anjou, Maine and Touraine, as they leaned towards Arthur with the backing of the French king, who would accept Arthur's homage for the Angevin lands. But John could always count on his brilliant mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Despite being quite old now, she was still a force of political nature. John made the first move, marching his army to Chinon, his father's former power base, and gaining the crucial treasury. While Arthur, who was still underage to rule, was moved to Paris by King Philip. It would appear to the Anglo-Normans that Arthur would be no more than a pawn of the French king. John was the older and more experienced choice, but as we've been exploring John's story, we know that by 1199, the choice for the barons was the devil they know or the devil they don't. John did have the support of one of the finest barons, William Marshal, who had served his father and brothers with distinction and is considered the best knight who ever lived. William's support would be crucial for John. The goal for John now was to be crowned King of England and proclaimed as Duke of Normandy. His mother met him at Chinon along with some of King Richard's most loyal men. They would carry out their task of bringing the king's body to its resting place at Fontevraud Abbey to rest alongside his father, King Henry. After swearing a few oaths to uphold the former king's wishes, John gained more support, which he would need as the French king was busy invading Normandy. John headed for Normandy, while his mother led an army with Richard's former right-hand man to crush any uprising in Anjou. And in April 1199, John was proclaimed Duke of Normandy at Rouen Cathedral. The next task for John was claiming the throne of England. England was relatively secure and safe. William Marshal had sailed to England first to enforce peace. So John still had some time before he needed to head to England. According to Roger of Hoveden, before John became Duke of Normandy, he had sacked and imprisoned the residents of Le Mans, even tearing down the walls, because they had declared for Arthur as their new lord. As for the efforts of the French king, Philip had made inroads into Maine, looting and pillaging around Ballon. Yet these actions turned the local lord, William de Roches, against Philip. The main problem for King Philip was that King Richard had built up a loyal network of barons, and the style of warfare during this period of the Middle Ages was mainly siege warfare. A siege could take a week or 6 months or even longer to capture a castle, time in which John could use to secure his position. By the 21st of May, John began to cross the English Channel, while William Marshal and Hubert Walters were keeping the peace. But the barons, bishops and earls of England sought to flex their military might by strengthening their own castles with men and provisions, something William and Hubert sought to remedy by calling a council and sending summons to the barons and earls, stating that John, when king, would pay them their dues if they behaved and pledged their loyalty, which they soon agreed to. And on the 27th of May, 1199, John was anointed and crowned King of England. Now began the job of trying to keep it all together. The first action King John took was the customary pilgrimage, a difficult task after having an enormous feast with 21 fat oxen. King John would visit the holy places around England, including one his father had inadvertently caused, the shrine of Thomas Becket, the murdered Archbishop of Canterbury. But while conducting his kingly duties, King John's plans were firmly fixed on returning to Normandy and securing his lands there. England, it seems, would resume its place as a kingdom with its king always in France, but now John was king, he needed to show power and authority. To summarize medieval kingship, it's all about puffing up your chest and looking as big and as powerful as you can, while also showing off nipple tassels to show your wealth. Now our saga of King John enters one of the most exciting periods of the Middle Ages, the 13th century, a century of great castles, abbeys, churches, and cathedrals being built or remodelled in Britain. There had always been plenty of churches, abbeys, and some cathedrals before the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The Normans brought with them the ideas of castles, and they constructed many wooden castles to begin with, and over time many were fortified with stonework. An example of a great castle that underwent changes during the 13th century was Pembroke Castle, under the orders of William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, replacing the wooden castle with stone and enlarging the keep, turning it into a great keep, which is still accessible today. These type of stone castles also had amenities, such as plumbing to bring in water, better latrines for easier human waste disposal, and in the case of some of the king's castles, an ensuite. There was also a great cellar for storing large quantities of food, and of course, wine of various quality. Cathedrals also developed impressively during this period. One example is Salisbury Cathedral, originally built near Old Sarum, but the weather and issues with the inhabitants of Old Sarum stressed the need for a new site, which was given by a papal bull. The building of the cathedral became a community project, and by 1258 the cathedral was complete. Parts of the cathedral were extended at the start of the 14th century. Salisbury Cathedral is still in magnificent condition and also displays a copy of the Magna Carta to the public. One of the main reasons for expansion happening within 13th century England was due to a massive increase in population. The figures estimate from 1066 to 1300 that the population of England rose to around 6 million, up from from around 2 million. This growth was driven by various factors, one being crops were grown more efficiently and more land was being cleared around England for an increasing amount of farmland. Woodlands were chopped down and areas were drained of water and ploughed through. Rivers were changed to flow on what was best for cultivating crops. With these lands being turned into agricultural centres, the need for new towns and villages developed as well. From the Norman Conquest until the end of King John's reign, over 100 towns were created. For King John's reign, the most famous town founded was Liverpool in 1207, with the king ordering, "The king to all who wish to have burgages in the town of Liverpool, greeting, know that we have granted to all who take burgages at Liverpool that they shall have all the liberties and free customs in the town of Liverpool, as enjoyed by other free boroughs on the sea coast in our land. And so we command that you may travel there safely and in our peace, in order to receive your burgages and to live there. In testimony of this, we send you our letters patent. Witness Simon de Patzel at Winchester, 27th August in the 9th year of our reign." As for politics in the 13th century, this quote sums up the politics of the time. 13th century politics have two aspects: the relations of the English crown with the European princes, with the King of Scots and the Princes of Wales, and with powerful vassals in the Marches and in Ireland, and the dealing of royal government with communities and social groups within the land, dictated to a large extent by foreign ambition and the demands they generated. Now that we've given a brief overview of the changes that were happening in the 13th century, we can now return to John, who had to prove not only he was a capable ruler, but that he was chosen to be the rightful king/duke over Arthur, a political weakness King Philip could exploit. King John maintained that he was always the rightful choice of heir, and we see this in some of his earliest charters, with King John stating in writing that divine mercy, with the consent and favour of both the clergy and people, which belongs to us by hereditary right. King John and King Philip would finally meet face to face by mid-August 1199, after the treaty had expired between them. The meeting went as well as we could expect, given the amount of peace conferences we've covered over the course of this series. King John asked why King Philip had viciously attacked him over a perceived slight. King Philip responded that John had not sought his permission to be made duke through homage, and made several unrealistic demands, such as handing over large chunks of territory. King John refused, and both men went their separate ways, plotting their next moves against each other. All of the details of this meeting comes from Roger of Howden's account. The now heightened tensions could lead to a new conflict within France. Climactic battles in this period are few and far between. For example, King Henry had never fought a pitched massive battle to decide the fate of his empire. For King John, after the meeting with King Philip, he may have decided a battle was destined in the near future against King Philip. Gervase of Canterbury states, "The English king made up his mind to resist the French king like a man, and to fight manfully for the peace of his country." King John already had an army in France, but he soon gained more allies. The Count of Flanders, Baldwin, made an alliance with King John. Roger of Howden's account states that The counts and barons of the kingdom of France, who had adhered to Richard, King of England, came to John, King of England, and did homage to King John, and made oath to him that they would not make terms with the King of France unless with his sanction and consent. And he swore to them that he would make no treaty with the King of France unless they were included therein. King John would gain another powerful ally with his nephew Otto being elected Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. On paper, it looked as if John held the upper hand against King Philip. With such powerful allies and agreements in place, King John seemed set to defeat the French king. Another boom for King John, his nephew Arthur would be escorted to him by William de Roches. William had initially sided with Arthur, but changed sides after a disagreement over a castle with King Philip. The moment was ripe to strike at King Philip, and King John marched his army to Hoveden, currently under siege from King Philip, and chased him away. Philip moved his forces to Le Mans, but was soon having to withdraw to his own territories, as King John had previously pulled the walls of the city down earlier in the year. King John must have felt elated about the success of his campaign. Not only had he driven the French king from his lands, but also now he had within his household his young nephew Arthur, and his mother as well. King John was on the cusp of something great, and then it all crumbled away. By January 1200, King John had sealed the Treaty of La Goulette with King Philip. The treaty was a means to an end over the conflict in Normandy and the issues with King Philip supporting Arthur. But before this treaty, King John could rely on his deceased brother's alliances and goodwill from the Normans, who hoped King John would attempt to be a somewhat competent duke to lead them. One alliance John would not be able to call upon in the south of France was the alliance Richard had fostered by marrying Berengaria of Navarre. King John would need to fortify what regions he could while the truce with King Philip remained in place. After all, King Philip had in his company Arthur, Duke of Brittany, King John's nephew. As King Philip and Arthur's father were close friends, we can imagine that King Philip had high hopes for Arthur, as if King John suddenly died. By all accounts, Arthur was King John's heir, as John and his wife Isabella, Countess of Gloucester, had no children. This was an issue on John's mind. The first of King John's problems was that Arthur and his mother had left in fear of being imprisoned, despite King John offering sweet words of promising to be all good friends. King John's forces did try and cut them off at various locations around Anjou, but they managed to flee to King Philip's court. Arthur's escape was a huge error, and now he was firmly within King Philip's influence. Not only that, but the papal legate had arranged a truce for all parties, and finally, a number of French nobles took up the cross for another crusade. King John could not count on their support, so he had to come to an agreement with the French king. The treaty between the two kings, as mentioned, was known as La Goulette. The interpretation of this treaty depends on the source. It could be seen as either a great triumph for King Philip and a huge loss for King John, or an underwhelming success for both sides. For King John, he achieved peace in May 1200 and was recognized as the successor to the French lands over Arthur, but on the condition he performed homage to King Philip as a vassal and paid a large sum of 20,000 marks. The most painful term for King John was giving King Philip part of Normandy along the Vixen. Fortifications around the contested area were torn down, and King John ended his alliance with his nephew Otto and some French counts. A marriage was also to take place between King John's niece and King Philip's son and heir, Louis. Duke Arthur was to be one of King John's men controlling Brittany. Peace was achieved, and King John could now travel his legitimately inherited empire in peace, until his loins got the better of him and he messed it all up. We've mentioned before about King John having issues producing an heir with his wife. John had plenty of illegitimate children. All three Angevin kings were promiscuous. King Richard had one child from a fling, called Philip, who killed the Viscount whose castle King Richard besieged before his fatal wound. John's illegitimate daughter, Joan, married Llewellyn the Great, one of the few masters of Wales. The problem for John was not having a legitimate heir to pass on the crown, something he would need to fix soon, as he was in his 30s. And to remedy this situation, he needed a divorce, which he already obtained in the first few months of his reign. And by August 1200, John married Isabella of Angoulême, the young countess of the county of Angoulême. The marriage for King John is interpreted by some sources as a marriage of lust by King John, but if we look at the strategic importance of the county, it provided another buffer towards King John's southern lands in France. The problem was that Isabella had already been betrothed to another man, Hugh de Lusignan, a lord based in Poitou. King John could have easily fixed this insult with suitable compensation, yet his egregious personality once again gave cause for his biggest rival to strike, as King John refused to offer anything for taking another man's betrothed. Perhaps King John had jokingly thought he had already done enough by fixing the prices of wine in Anjou and Poitou. While King John was busy showing his subjects their new queen with a lavish and expensive coronation for himself and Isabella in England in October 1200, in France, discontent started manifesting. While in England, King John met with the King of Scots, William the Lion. King William's main issue with King John was securing lands he had a claim to in Northumbria, whereas King John wanted to claim overlordship of Scotland, as his father had done previously, before King Richard had sold Scotland back to William for funds towards the Third Crusade. The two kings met at Lincoln, where King William performed homage to King John. The homage was not for the Kingdom of Scotland, just as one of King John's sworn men. William tried to negotiate with King John over the lands in the north of England, but nothing other than a truce came out of the talks. King John could return to France knowing England was secure in December 1200. Yet King John exacerbated the growing discontent in his lands in France when he ordered his men to seize Hugh's lands in Le Mans in March 1201, while he and Isabella would travel around the north of England. In Poitou, Hugh, unsurprisingly, revolted. Hugh's uncle Geoffrey also joined in the uprising, and soon more nobles took up arms against John in Poitou. For King Philip, this was now the golden opportunity to further encroach into Normandy. As Hugh's family soon took their complaint to him, to which King Philip was happy to aid. King John was a sworn man to King Philip for his lands in France, meaning King Philip had an obligation to act as a peacekeeper, and in the process making himself look as attractive as possible as a liege lord over King John, which would benefit him in the future. As for King John, he was ordering his nobles to provide troops for a campaign into Poitou, with troops assembling around Portsmouth. Yet that disconnect we mentioned before, with English nobles disinterested in providing troops and supplies for a campaign abroad, returned. King John did allow some to return home by them offering something King John always liked: money. By the middle of May 1201, King John had arrived in Normandy. King John knew what kind of situation he faced in France, as he was in regular correspondence with his mother, Eleanor, while she was sick and resting at Fontevraud Abbey. King John's first task was to meet King Philip near the border of Normandy. The slow beginning of the French monarchy's increased centralization in France would soon start to pick up pace after this meeting. This quote explains the rise of the power of the French monarchy perfectly. French kings had often in the past been forced to rely on their claimed rights as one of the few ways to establish any authority over recalcitrant vassals. Legal rights had always played a major part. Now that the King of France was becoming genuinely powerful, these claims could be put to even greater effect. So Philip sought to gain a hold over all his vassals by claiming the right of jurisdiction over them in the royal court. And now, if they refused to abide by royal jurisdiction, King Philip was powerful enough to enforce those rights via military action, and King John would soon experience this. But in the meantime, the two kings travelled to Paris, where they wined and dined in each other's company, with King Philip showcasing his splendour with gifts and good wine, ending the affair with the kiss of peace, and coming to agreements that King John would act in his duty of keeping the peace by offering justice to the Lusignans. Relations were improved, and King John set about fixing the issues in Poitou. King John sought to deal justice his way with the matter of the Lusignans' complaints, by charging them with treason, along with settling the legal claims with a judicial duel, a preferred form of clearing disputes that we know King John enjoyed from his time in Ireland. The Lusignans refused and asked King Philip to intercede. With this, King Philip could really start piling on the political pressure on King John, demanding John give control of important castles in Normandy to guarantee his oath. Once again, King John, acting heavy-handed and displaying his egregious personality, would end in disaster for him. By late March 1202, there was an event we haven't mentioned in a while, a peace conference. Yet this time, there were no kings present. Tensions were high, and the discussions that were taking place were conducted by messengers. King Philip demanded that John stand trial in Paris for his poor conduct. King John dragged his feet on the matter, and King Philip's court judged him to be guilty of disobedience. John was to be stripped of all of his titles and French possessions. Of course, King John was not going to give it all up without a fight, and King Philip had already been planning an attack on Normandy. Not only that, but King Philip still held influence over Duke Arthur of Brittany, who was finally old enough to command a force of his own. Arthur was given the task of taking control of Anjou and Poitou, and in letters of agreement between Arthur and Philip, Arthur refers to himself as Duke of Aquitaine, Brittany, Count of Anjou, and Le Mans. King John was already on the back foot, while King Philip's forces were capturing more of Normandy. Arthur was also busy attacking the Angevin lands. The situation was becoming so dire that the elderly Eleanor started to take command. Yet she soon found herself besieged by Arthur, her grandson, at Mirabeau. If Arthur could capture his grandmother, he'd have a stronger hand in the peace talks. King John received the news of the terrible situation his mother was in, and in a rare instance, John showed a burst of personal bravery and military prowess, galloping forth with his knights. King John dashed and covered somewhere between 80 to 200 miles in under 2 days, as by the time he reached the castle, the town had been taken, as well as the outer part of the castle. Only the keep was holding out. The atmosphere in Arthur's camp was a relaxed attitude to what seemed a foregone conclusion when fighting suddenly broke out in the streets of the town, and before long Arthur and his allies were captured. It was a tremendous victory for King John. In one daring attack, he had captured most of his enemies and saved his mother. One of our sources states the following on the success. It was a greater and more decisive victory that had ever been won by his father or brother. John sent a jubilant letter to his regents in England, describing his triumph in detail and concluding with the words, "God be praised for our happy success." This was King John's greatest victory, and his last. The Battle of Mirabeau was King John's greatest military victory. He had captured his biggest rival, his nephew, Duke Arthur of Brittany, and the Lusignans, the family that caused the uprising against King John due to him charging them for treason. While King John initially started on the defence by securing his castles around Normandy, his one offensive move turned the situation around for him. But, as we will see, his personality and actions would reduce his greatest military achievement to a simple footnote in his saga. In this final episode, we'll see King John lose the empire he so desperately tried to gain, and the conflict that would see his painful and dull end, the First Barons' War. The news of Arthur and his allies' capture forced King Philip to retreat to reorganize his forces. It seemed King John was once again on the cusp of sweeping all his enemies before him. Yet King John's treatment of Arthur is possibly the worst action of his reign, and a damning chapter of King John's legacy, the mystery of Arthur's death. Arthur was first locked up at Falaise, and then moved and disappeared at Rouen. The boy's body has never been found. While it's impossible to say whether he was murdered or died trying to escape, the general consensus is that King John had Arthur murdered. Plenty of chroniclers attest as such. The motives for Arthur's murder by King John are compelling. First, he was the only male rival for the whole of the Angevin Empire, and if Arthur married and produced children, those children would become rivals against King John's, or replacements, if, for example, powerful barons wanted King John replaced. Arthur was also firmly allied to King Philip. And finally, one influence towards murder is King John's time in Ireland when he was a young man of 18. We've mentioned how Irish politics influenced King John, particularly dealing with rivals, as in Ireland, killing hostages and rivals was simple politics. In King John's mind, it would have been easier to permanently get rid of Arthur as opposed to coming to terms and releasing him, as Arthur could renege on any oath sworn. However, that course of agreement is the norm of the time in high Middle Ages England and France. A secondary problem is that if Arthur did die trying to escape, King John would have been compelled to display the body in state to try and dispel any rumours of murder, and as no remains were ever produced, it's more evidence towards that King John had his nephew killed. Rumours of Arthur's fate spread all across England and France. One of the most vicious rumours was that King John had personally killed Arthur in a drunken rage, and then had his corpse dumped in the River Seine. Killing a close relative, especially one of high nobility, was reprehensible. Not only this, but King John had treated his prisoners in such vile ways that some of his allies began to desert him and join King Philip. One account, the Margam Abbey Chronicle, located in Wales, records that King John had captured Arthur and kept him alive in prison for some time in the castle of Rouen. After dinner on the Thursday before Easter, when he was drunk and possessed by the devil, King John killed him with his own hand, and tying a heavy stone to the body, cast it into the Seine. Matthew Paris and Ralph of Coggeshall both offer different tales of the fate of Arthur, yet both are recording in different times. Coggeshall is chronicling around the time, and Paris is recording decades later. Whatever fate befell Arthur, we will never know for certain, but the legacy of his disappearance is another damning condemnation of King John. The consequences for King John would be losing the support of the Norman nobility, and more of his allies was simply swapping one direct liege lord for another, King Philip. From Anjou to Poitou, the Angevin Empire was rapidly crumbling. There was also the wrath of the Bretons, angry at the perceived killing of their lord. The military situation for King John by 1203 was becoming untenable. King Philip was invading Normandy again in Easter, and by August, the French king was besieging the mighty fortress of Chateau Gilliard, King Richard's pride and joy castle. As for King John, at the start of 1203, he was trying to make amends with the Lusignans by releasing Hugh and Geoffrey, freeing the men of the family that began the event that would turn into the disastrous situation, was a desperate last measure to try and secure Poitou. But that plan turned into smoke once King John received the news that his wife was trapped at Chinon. Once again, King John made a desperate dash towards Chinon with his army, passing Alençon, when, a few miles away from the town, King John received further news that the Count of Alençon, Robert, had switched sides and received troops to bolster the town. King John's rearguard was now exposed. The pure anger King John felt is recorded in his own documents for the year. Instead of stating, in the 4th year of our reign, he states, the year when Count Robert betrayed us. As for King Philip, his plan was still the same: the conquest of Normandy. The repercussions of Arthur's murder would benefit Philip in the future. For now, siege warfare was the business of the day, and King Philip would display his mastery of besieging and capturing castles. King John had managed to send one of his knights to Chinon to escort his wife Isabella to Le Mans. While King John had been busy organising the defence of his lands, writing writs and shoring up his castles, King John was also seeking papal help to help bring the conflict to an end, in order to secure his positions around Normandy and deal with unruly counts around his lands across France. But, despite attempts at mediation, King Philip refused. He knew King John lacked support within his own territories and wanted nothing else but the conquest of Normandy. And by March 1203, more barons and lords were swapping out John for Philip as their liege lord. King John had few allies he could trust, and the mercenaries King John hired were only loyal to coin or what plunder they could obtain. One baron King John did trust was William de Brieux, a powerful baron. He held lands all across England, Ireland, Normandy, and Wales, thanks to King John. But one loyal baron wasn't enough, and John was rapidly losing the support of the Normans. For the last 10 years, had experienced an almost constant cycle of warfare, plus the cost of such wars. And by May 1203, Anjou and Maine had fallen to King Philip. While King John did try at the start of King Philip's offensive to obtain peace by offering money, when that failed, he tried to organise what defences he could and managed to seize back a few castles in Normandy during the summer of 1203. But John lacked so much support and was running empty on funds even after quickly sacking around Brittany in September. The situation was becoming so dire that William Marshal bluntly put it to King John that, "Sire, listen to what I have to say. You have few friends. If you choose to strengthen your enemies, then your own power will decline. If a man strengthens his enemies, it is justifiable for men to attack. You paid no attention to the first sign of discontent, but it would have been better for us all if you had." While that quote comes from the deeds of William Marshal, an account detailing the Marshal's life, and is favourable to him, we can imagine a conversation similar to that occurring between John and William. King John's reaction saw the return of the Angevin anger, and he marched to his chambers enraged. The situation was terrible, and King John, after promising to return with support from the English barons and to gather more funds, left Normandy on the 5th of December 1203. Without knowing it, that was the last time he ever saw Normandy again. King John landed at Portsmouth on the 7th of December 1203, in time to enjoy Christmas at Canterbury, where he mused to the Archbishop of Canterbury that he was forced to leave Normandy due to treachery. In French sources, he gained a new nickname, Soft Sword, meaning a lack of fight or bravery to defend Normandy to the last man, as his brother and father might have done. But the nickname of Lackland returns as well. While King John was in England, the important Chateau Gilliard was still under heavy siege, and while this impressive castle could hold out better than most castles King Philip had captured, without support, the castle would fall. King John did make one attempt to relieve the castle earlier in that year. It failed. By February 1204, King Philip's forces had collapsed the outer wall of the castle. By the start of March, only the keep remained. And on the 6th of March 1204, the remaining garrison of Chateau Gilliard were dragged out. The fall of this castle acted as a domino effect across Normandy. Towns and cities just gave up without a fight. Why fight for a duke who wasn't present? The most important city in Normandy, Rouen, would have been a daunting challenge to capture. The city featured impressive walls and plenty of hazardous ditches to any besieger. But this army wasn't some rabble rebel army. This was the army of the King of France. King Philip arrived to take control of what he and his court deemed lawful. And after securing an agreement with the commander of the city that, if no help arrived from John in 30 days, the city would be open to King Philip. The city of Rouen capitulated a week before the agreement ended. Normandy, for the first time in over 300 years, was now in the direct control of the King of France. Quite a change from King of Franks. John, meanwhile, was enjoying a good hunt and later celebrating his Ascension Day of becoming King of England. The Angevin Empire was no more. While Normandy had fallen, so had most of the other Angevin lands. And even worse news in April 1204, Queen Eleanor had died. Her death created uncertainty in the Duchy of Aquitaine, and lords within Aquitaine were eager to offer direct homage to King Philip over John, who by rights of succession was now the Duke of a faltering duchy. The victory at Mirabeau was now a hollow memory. The city of Chinon also fell to King Philip in September. Most of King John's loyal men had returned with him to England. The major problem for some of these barons was that they held both lands in France and in England, and with the conquest of Normandy, Anjou, etc., they had to choose which lord to perform homage to, John or now King Philip. There was also the economy aspect, which was exacerbated by inflation. Northern Europe from 1170 onwards seems to have experienced a period of sharp monetary inflation. Wages and prices rocketed. King John, whose income depended upon fixed rents from lands, found himself with massively increased expenditure, but with no compensating rise, either in rents or profits of war. In these circumstances, his only alternative was to impose heavier taxations on his barons, themselves victims of precisely the same economic pressures as the king. While King John was dealing with the fallout over the loss of Normandy and trying to secure what remained of the Duchy of Aquitaine, he would battle his next political enemy, the Pope. The current head of the papacy was Innocent III. Another testament to King John's bad luck is that he faced great historical characters, and Innocent is considered one of the greatest popes who wielded significant political authority. He would clash with not just King John, but other kings as well, including King Philip of France. Pope Innocent was fully prepared to use the political might of the papacy to enforce the rights of the Church over the kings of Europe. The dispute between King John and Pope Innocent began with the death of Hubert Walters, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in July 1205. To control the powerful position of Archbishop would certainly be a benefit to King John, and he put forward a loyal man, John de Grey, the Bishop of Norwich. The bishop offered a tasty 5,000 marks for the position. As if King John could control the position, he could tax the clergy or extort more funds for campaigns. The relationship between king and archbishop had to be a positive working one, as King John's father, Henry II, had a disastrous relationship with one of his archbishops, Thomas Becket. Thankfully, King John never cried out, "Who shall deliver me from this turbulent priest?" While King John put forward his man for the role, the monks of Canterbury had their own choice, but King John exerted pressure on the monks to support his candidate to the Pope. Yet Pope Innocent rejected both in May 1206 and would directly appoint his own man to the position, even demanding that the monks of Canterbury travel to Rome in order for the election to be preceded by the papacy. All of this political back and forth took time, and King John was busy trying to coax more money from the clergy. After all, King John sought what his predecessors all wanted: royal control over the church. By June 1207, Pope Innocent made his choice. Stephen Langton, an Englishman who taught in Paris, would be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. King John was less than enthusiastic about this selection of Archbishop, and vented his anger towards the Pope in a letter, stating that Langton was a man altogether unknown to him, who had been familiar for a long time with his declared enemies in the Kingdom of France. King John would take some petty revenge, not on the Pope, but the nearest people he could find, the monks of Canterbury. John sent mercenaries with crossbows to harass the monks, with most of them fleeing. John then took their land and gave it to some of his loyal men. It seems King John wouldn't inadvertently kill an archbishop as his father did. He just wouldn't have one. The rest of King John's letter to the Pope also mentioned that England had given plenty of dosh to the Papal State, but also that he would never stop to defend his rights as king, and in an incredibly bold move towards the Pope, which is one reason why the Tudors admired him, John would just ignore the Catholic Church if he didn't get his way. The martyrdom of Thomas Becket was to be a strong parallel to Langton, as King John refused to allow him to enter England. The Pope responded by issuing an interdict on England. King John was now testing the political power of the Pope, a game he would eventually lose. In the meantime, King John would take what he wanted from the clergy: money for more campaigns into France, establishing an effective system of taking the wives and lovers of the clergymen and selling them back to the men of the cloth, reveling in the hypocrisy. By 1209, Pope Innocent further flexed his authority and excommunicated King John, making King John the first ever King of England to be excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Yet King John neither feared God nor regarded man. It was as if he alone were mighty upon earth. Only military force could drag King John back into the fold, or he could be replaced. But who could replace him? Arthur had been dead for years, and by the year 1213, rumours were circulating that King Philip would be the one to invade England, with the Pope's blessing, if King John did not submit to the Pope. King Philip was more than happy to provide his son Louis with the throne of England, as John's father, King Henry, had done with Ireland. But in a complete pivot, King John managed to save his kingdom and position from invasion on the 15th of May 1213 near Dover, in a manner that rivaled his father's penance, by swearing to the papal legate that he and the Kingdom of England and Ireland would be vassals of the papal state. The invasion of England by King Philip was already dashed by the Earl of Salisbury, whose ships had destroyed the French fleet at Flanders, making the Pope's power null when compared to the soldiers who carried the day. All the Pope could do was wag his finger in disapproval if kings disobeyed him. And while King John was confined in England and creating plans to take back his lands in France, his neighbours, the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh, would unfortunately get to know him, as King John set about subjugating the whole of Britain and Ireland. We've already covered Ireland and King John's actions there. The princes of Wales and the King of Scots were prime targets for King John to flex his authority. King John started by meddling into the affairs of Wales, at first in 1199, where King John supported rivals in the Kingdom of Deheubarth, a once great kingdom in Wales, gaining land for himself. But King John also encountered another great historical figure, Llewellyn the Great. Llewellyn and King John came to an agreement. One of our sources state, Llewellyn swore an oath of allegiance to King John in 1201 and married Joan, the king's illegitimate daughter, in 1205. John was a man of unstable character, although recent research shows that he was not the monster of traditional portrayal. He had a genius for making enemies. This again alludes to King John's horrible personality. Wales did suffer from the effects of the Pope's interdict. There was also a renewed focus on conquering more of Wales, as King John had charged his favourite baron, William de Brioze, to take more land from the native Welsh princes. Yet William would suffer the most from his close relationship with King John, falling out and fleeing from Wales to Ireland and then finally to France, where he died. Llewellyn attempted to take advantage of the now power vacuum in Wales, and while he would be successful in the future, by 1210 Llewellyn was becoming powerful enough that King John would seek to curtail Llewellyn's rising power by invading Wales in 1211. The first invasion failed. The second ended when both armies were camped just across from each other, separated by a river. Llewellyn capitulated, and he came to an agreement with King John that if he failed to produce a male heir, King John would inherit his throne. Unsurprisingly, King John managed to annoy the Welsh by building castles on disputed lands. The Welsh revolted in 1212, while King John was still excommunicated, leading to the Pope to give his support to the Welsh. And Llewellyn found himself not only in a stronger position in a short turnaround, but now the King of France, Philip, was writing to him. Llewellyn's response was fangirling over King Philip. King John found himself unable to invade Wales due to planning an attack in France and had fallen out with his barons, which leads us to 1213. Now for Scotland. Since King John's ascension to the English throne in 1199, Scotland had been ruled by King William the Lion since 1165. King William is one of the longest ruling Scottish kings. During his lengthy reign, he lost Scotland temporarily as a kingdom to King Henry II, after joining the failed uprising against Henry, before buying back the kingdom from King Richard. but now dealing with King John, who sought to subjugate Scotland once more, and in 1209, King John invaded Scotland. By this time, William was old and frail, and no match for an invigorated King John, who had in his retinue his son-in-law Llewellyn. The resulting invasion led to the Treaty of Norham, where the King of Scots had to pay a fat stack of cash and entrust hostages, which included two of the king's daughters. They would be married off through the English court. King William would never gain revenge in his lifetime, as he died in late 1214, but his successor, King Alexander II, would feature in the terms of the Magna Carta of 1215. With King John losing Normandy and being forced to stay in England for a time to build up funds and his power base, the barons of England would get to know their king more, as King John travelled extensively across England, staying in one location for a day or two and then moving on to the next. King John was an active king, always seeking cash through various means, taxation, fines, scutage, etc. Despite King John himself being particularly wealthy, the cost of such wars, from provisions to ships, outweighed King John's own personal wealth, making taxation a necessity. Now the barons of England had to deal with a king right on their doorstep, rather than howling for funds from France. The first attempt at recovering the lands in France was in 1205. That failed, and King John sought to blame William Marshal, even calling for the Marshal to be challenged by way of combat. Yet nobody took up the challenge. William Marshal had the phenomenal ability, when dealing with King John, of simply turning the other cheek. While the king raged and threw a tantrum, William was always able to come out on top. And in this situation, one of our sources tells us that King John, in despair, John sailed round the Isle of Wight before returning to his kingdom, having caused his subjects to fear that he had gone off to the continent on a reckless adventure without his army. The next attempt was in 1206. This expedition fared much better than the one in 1205. England and its borders were secure, and in June 1206, King John was back in France, landing at La Rochelle. King John had shown his talent for preparation by the safe arrival of this fleet, crossing the sea into enemy waters and making sure the cash for the campaign was well protected. King John was received warmly by the nobles of the area, and in turn King John released prisoners. Yet the arrival of King John's forces kicked the French King Philip into motion, who in turn organised a defence of Normandy, and sent his loyal men to defend other regions in the area. But rather than march straight towards Normandy, King John set his sight on Bordeaux in the south, as King Alfonso VIII had invaded in 1204 on the context that the region of Gascony was his right by virtue of his marriage to Eleanor of England, King John's sister. Alfonso had already left for Castile, and by August King John had secured Gascony. Now he was free to march north and attempt to probe the defences of his former territories, reaching as far as Brittany. Yet King John didn't receive the warmest of welcomes. After all, he had killed the Duke of Brittany, and now being this close to Normandy, the French king himself soon arrived with his army. In one account, the French king pillaged around Thouars and flexed his military might by offering battle to King John, who was currently residing at Thouars. King John refused, and by October, King John had concluded a truce with King Philip over a 2-year period. Now King John had seen what kind of challenges he faced if he wanted the whole of his former territories back. King John would now spend the next 8 years building towards that goal at any cost, and King John would work towards building a strong coalition similar to the one he had cultivated back in 1200. Yet his tireless effort of raising such cash and his personality would cause his downfall. By 1212, preparations were underway to invade France again. As mentioned, the Welsh revolted. The English barons, particularly the northern barons, weren't interested in another round of invasions into a place they had no benefits in trying to take. The fires of rebellion were slowly being stoked. In 1210, landowners, knights, and clergymen were all feeling the brunt of King John's obsessive taxation, and they were fearful of King John due to his treatment of anyone who crossed him. The problem for King John is that this discontent was something to rally behind and find common ground to demand change. There were quite a few barons in England during the 13th century. Some were more extreme than others in their approach to dealing with problems. In August 1212, King John was staying at Nottingham, where he heard of a terrifying plot against not just him, but his family, the Baron Conspiracy, with the goal being to drive the king and his family from the kingdom and choose someone else as king in his place. This plot was quickly resolved, and the two barons implicated in the plot fled abroad. By 1213, King John was enacting his plan for the reconquest of his lands in France. The money he had raised over the years was finally put to use. He had made peace with the Pope and the Welsh. King John's allies were now ready to strike. Yet still, the northern barons refused to give military service, again stating that they owed no service for lands in France. By November 1213, King John had issued summons to bring 4 knights from each county in England to meet at Oxford with their weapons of war. And finally, in February 1214, King John launched his reconquest. By the middle of September 1214, he failed. His allies had been defeated at the Battle of Bouvines, and King John made peace with the French for 5 years. All his plans were now a pile of ash, and he was politically weak. King John knew he faced a political fallout and tried to conduct damage control, sending 2 loyal men to secure castles in England. There was also the church still demanding compensation for the looting that occurred during the interdict, but rumours were widely circulating that the barons were seeking to rebel, and King John prepared to face this uprising by hiring mercenaries. Even the Pope tried to curtail any uprisings by writing to one baron that they should not stand in the way of the king's justices and government officials. Yet refusals to pay taxes from some of the shires of England was already happening in 1214. Several barons met at Bury, St. Edmunds, where the topic was unsurprisingly about King John and how to deal with him. Here we see the barons were presented with a charter from the reign of King Henry I, King John's great-grandfather. The man presenting this charter was the Archbishop of Canterbury. To summarise this charter from 1100, it sought to fix bad laws and the excessive amount of taxation towards the shires of England, and also payments of inheritance. The scope of these details would be used towards legislating the Magna Carta. By January 1215, King John and the barons met on neutral ground. The barons sought to make the king abide by the 1100 charter, whereas King John sought to play for time to build up his forces and seek papal help. The barons did the same. But the Pope was firmly on the side of his vassal. Tensions were mounting, with both the king and the baron preparing for a major war between them, and by June 1215 both sides met at Runnymede, another place of neutral ground. King John had arrived well prepared. He had an army of mercenaries near the coast, and he had the full backing of the Pope, even more so after giving crusading vows. The issue of paying scutage to the king was also now a moot point for the barons, as the Pope dealt with that issue as well. The barons were now backed into a corner in terms of negotiations. They had one card to play, rescinding their oaths to the king on the 5th of May. The barons had a strong ally in the Archbishop of Canterbury, who would mediate and try to find a resolution for both parties. As for King John, he still needed time to build up his forces. His plan was to copy what his father had always done when dealing with discontent, push the discontented into a corner and crush them when they rose up. Yet King John had pushed too many different factions into a corner, the barons, the Londoners, knights, etc. Now they were one faction, and at Runnymede, the terms of the 1215 version of the Magna Carta were sealed, yet there was never any peace before and after the sealing of the Magna Carta. Implementing the Charter was one issue. The other is that King John was never going to abide by the Charter. Why would he? He was a sworn vassal of the Pope. His barons could not enforce any treaty onto him without the consent of his liege lord, the Pope. And with that, the First Barons' War began. The barons finally sought to replace King John with Prince Louis, King Philip's son and heir. Prince Louis could claim the throne of England thanks to his marriage to Blanche of Castile, King John's niece. And by October 1216, King John had lost half of the Kingdom of England to the rebel barons and Prince Louis. King John was now also sick with dysentery and constant pains in his legs. King John, the last Angevin king, died between the 18th and 19th of October 1216. Now that we've covered the life of King John, the final part is to look at his legacy. The first part is that he left England embroiled in a civil war and a young heir, his son Henry, who, with the support of some loyal barons such as William Marshal, would lead the royal forces to victory and attempt to re-establish royal authority for young King Henry when he became of age. The most important part of King John's legacy is the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, although King John probably wouldn't like that. However, the first charter failed. King John violated rights that already existed in English law, but for England and its people, Magna Carta provided a stepping stone towards a modern constitution over the centuries. John's overall legacy is a negative one. He was cruel, with a dark sense of humour, paranoid, and just a horrible person to deal with. The murder of his nephew Arthur, in my opinion, is the worst moment in his reign. The act of committing nepticide is just another damning aspect of King John's reign, and is one reason of many why he is considered a bad king. There are numerous other examples: the hounding of the Brioche family, and the fate of the son and wife of William de Brioche. William, who at one point was King John's closest ally. If King John treated his allies this way, then it's not a stretch of the imagination to wonder the fate of Duke Arthur. John was also a bad king for a prosperous time. While King John did order the creation of significant castles and cities, both in England and Ireland, I believe that King John was the wrong king to take full advantage of the growth of early 13th century England. Also, his actions led to the First Barons' War, which to the people of England caused suffering. England had not experienced a civil war since the anarchy. As for his burial site, Worcester Cathedral was the best place for him, given the circumstances he died in. And down the centuries, John being buried in Worcester saved his remains, as if he was buried with most of his family at Fontevraud Abbey. His remains would have been disturbed during the French Revolution. It's rather sad that King John isn't around any of his immediate family. Even his children were entombed elsewhere, as were both his wives. The closest family member entombed near him is a descendant several centuries down the line. A historical irony is that the entombed descendant is Arthur Tudor, at one point the heir to the throne of England, as had Arthur, Duke of Brittany, had been. It's ironic King John shares his resting place near an Arthur, and in another twist, having Arthur Tudor entombed at Worcester may have saved King John's own tomb from destruction by the dissolution of the monasteries enacted by King Henry VIII, Prince Arthur's younger brother. It seems even in death, King John encounters tremendous luck and terrible bad luck. When we first started this series, we looked at King John's reputation during different time periods and examined what the people of those periods said about King John during his life and after his death. There were hardly any contemporary chroniclers that spoke highly of King John. The Anonymous of Bethune mentions King John being a good host. It didn't help that some of the chroniclers of King John's time were members of the clergy, meaning they certainly had a bias towards him, although some did work with King John directly, such as Gerald of Wales. Gerald experienced King John's vile personality firsthand, but as we move along the timeline into Tudor England, King John's legacy was used to portray as a sort of hero fighting the evil Pope. This is when England broke away from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, and John was used as an unlikely hero given he was the first English monarch to be excommunicated by the Catholic Church and was forced to capitulate towards the Pope. As we move forward in time into the Victorian age, John's reputation and legacy come under renewed focus due to British nationalism and imperialism, with Victorian historians focusing on John's loss of French lands in 1204, giving England the means to develop its own identity and forge its national destiny, according to Victorian historians. For our time, the question is, what do we do with King John's legacy and reputation? He still is, and forever will be, Bad King John.